On the night of the 25th of August 2011, a 3-year-old woman named Risa Dura and her husband Hioki Dura were sitting together on their couch. They were in their apartment in Kanazawa City, Japan, and they were just watching some TV. And as they sat there, they were both laughing hysterically at what was on the screen. It was their absolute favorite show, a hidden camera comedy prank show. For them, this was the perfect way to end the day, just sitting here together on the couch, laughing their heads off. Risa and Hioki had only been married for 4 months. They were still deep in that newlywed bliss period where they spent basically every possible second they could with each other. When Hioki wasn't at work, the two of them were always out and about. They'd go out to eat at their favorite restaurants, they'd go to the movies, or they'd take little day trips to the beach, since Kanazawa City was right there on the coast. And whenever they were out, they were constantly talking about how lucky they felt. They truly believed they had found their perfect match in each other. They were married, and this was what the rest of their lives was going to look like. Just being together, happy. They felt like the luckiest people in the world. Risa and Hioki had actually known each other for a long time. They first met when they were just kids in middle school. But back then, Hioki was extremely shy. He was so quiet that he really didn't speak to Risa at all. He had a crush on her, but he never let it show. So, nothing ever came of it. But then, years later, after they had both finished college and were starting their adult lives, they just happened to run into each other again. And this time, Hioki, who was still a bit shy but had grown more confident, decided he had to tell Risa the truth. He confessed to her that he had always loved her all the way back in middle school, and that he still did. Risa was totally shocked by this. She had always kind of felt something for him too, but because he was so quiet, it just never seemed like he was interested in her at all. So to her, this was this incredible revelation, but it was more than just a surprise. It was incredibly romantic. It felt like something out of a classic Hollywood love story. This quiet boy she knew from her childhood had been harboring this secret love for her all these years. And so, when he finally confessed his feelings, she pretty much immediately said yes to a date. She was so excited, and from that very first date, it was just a total whirlwind. They fell completely and totally in love, and within a year, they were married. They ended up settling in Kanazawa City mostly because of Hioki's job. He worked for a company that was based in the city, and he was doing really well there. He was considered a rising star. Every time Risa would meet one of his coworkers, they would rave about him. They'd say what a hard worker he was, what a natural-born leader he was becoming. Risa was so proud of him. But more than that, she felt inspired by his drive and his passion for his work. It made her want to find a really fulfilling job for herself, something she could be just as passionate about. So, she was actively on the hunt for her own career. But for the moment, Risa was still in that phase of trying to figure out exactly what she wanted to do. She had so many interests and was always jumping from one thing to another. She had this huge, insatiable curiosity about the world, and she absolutely loved trying new things. This was a wonderful quality, but it also made it really hard for her to choose just one single path for her life. But Hioki was incredibly supportive through all of it. He treated Risa like she was royalty. He always told her that whatever she wanted to do was completely fine by him as long as it made her happy. He just wanted to see her smile. So for now, as Risa sat on the couch next to Hioki, laughing at this funny show, her mind started to wander. It drifted away from the television and away from her ongoing job search and landed on Hioki's birthday. It was coming up very soon, and she felt this immense pressure to do something really, really special for him. A big part of that pressure came from the fact that Hioki always did something incredibly thoughtful and amazing for her. For her birthday, for any special occasion, he really knew how to celebrate her and make her feel loved. She didn't want to underwhelm him with her gift. Plus, this was going to be the first time either of them had a birthday now that they were officially married. So Risa wanted to go all out. She wanted to plan something that Hioki would never, ever forget. But as she sat there on the couch trying to brainstorm the perfect birthday celebration, she just kept drawing a blank. It felt like the only thing she could really focus on that they shared was their romantic nature. They were both very romantic people. So whatever she did, it had to be romantic in some way. But how? She wasn't sure. In many ways, she and her husband were very different in how they expressed their affection. Hioki was still that quiet, reserved person he'd always been. His displays of affection were usually very reserved and private just for her. But Risa, on the other hand, was a massive extrovert. She was full of energy, and so her displays of affection were often over the top, big, and boisterous. So Risa was really struggling, trying to think of how she could combine their two styles of romance into one perfect celebration. And then, all of a sudden, it was like she had an epiphany. She saw it perfectly in her mind's eye. The perfect way to celebrate his birthday. She didn't even know what had inspired it, it just came to her in a flash. She would take her husband out for a very romantic walk on the beach at night. But then, at the end of the walk, there would be this huge surprise. An over-the-top fireworks display just for him. It was the perfect idea. It was romantic, and it was a little crazy, just like her. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, Risa and 6 of her friends were at Osaki Beach. This was the beach where the big birthday surprise was going to happen that very night. Risa had spent the previous day while Hioki was at work planning out all the details of the party. But now, on the day of, there was some actual physical setup that needed to be done. This wasn't just going to be a walk on the beach with some fireworks. There was another element to her plan, a secret prank element, and she needed her friends' help for that. So, on this afternoon, they were walking along the beach looking for the perfect spot. The spot needed to do 2 things. First, it had to afford Risa and her husband some privacy, so it would feel very romantic and intimate. But it also needed to have a good vantage point for her friends, a place where they could hide and watch the couple. They needed to be able to see Risa's signal so they would know exactly when to light the fireworks. And so Risa and her friends are walking along the sand, scanning the coastline, and then they see it. There was this private, sort of secluded section of the beach that had a long row of thick shrubbery lining the back of it. It was perfect. The bushes would be a perfect hiding spot for her friends. And the beach itself, down on the sand, was nice and private and peaceful. They all agreed this was the best spot for the big party. So, they got to work. Her friends went up into the bushes and started getting their fireworks ready, figuring out the best way to set them up for a quick launch. Meanwhile, Risa went down to the sandy part of the beach and she prepped the area where she and Hioki would be standing. The final touch was laying out a big blue sheet on the sand. This would be their mark, the spot where they needed to be for the surprise to work perfectly. Once the blue sheet was in place, she walked back up to her friends in the bushes. They all confirmed that everything was ready to go. Risa told her friends the plan was to be back there that night at exactly 10 p.m. with her husband. She told them they should probably get there a little bit earlier, just to make sure they were all set up and hidden. They all agreed, and then they packed up and left the beach. As Risa left the beach that afternoon, she found herself feeling incredibly antsy. She was just so excited about this big surprise party she had planned for that night. She just wanted it to be 10 p.m. already so she could finally reveal everything she had in store for Hioki. But she also knew she had to play it cool. She couldn't give away any hint that she had this big surprise planned. So, when she got back home where Hioki was waiting, she acted like everything was totally normal. When she walked inside, she told Hioki to just go relax on the couch while she made them both a very nice dinner. She wanted to pamper him a little bit. When dinner was ready, the two of them sat down at the table. Risa pretended like she had absolutely nothing planned for his birthday weekend. She casually asked him, "Hey, what should we do this weekend to celebrate your birthday?" They talked about maybe going to see some friends or going out to a movie, just brainstorming ideas. But of course, it was all a big act. Risa knew exactly what they were doing that night. Later, when it was getting kind of late and it seemed like Hioki was maybe thinking about heading to bed, Risa made her move. She said, "Wait a minute. It's your birthday weekend." Let's not go to bed just yet. Let's go for a walk on the beach. What a great romantic idea that would be. Hioki was a little surprised by the suggestion, it being so late, but he thought about it for a second and then said, actually, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go for it. As soon as he said yes, Risa could barely contain her excitement. She knew she had this amazing, incredible thing planned for him down at the beach, and it was about to happen. This was going to be awesome. And so, she and her husband quickly cleaned up the dinner dishes. And then, just before 10 p.m., they left their apartment, got in their car, and started heading to the beach. About 10 minutes later, they parked at the end of a dead-end road right near the beach. When they got out of the car, they were surrounded by bushes on all sides of the road. But there was a little sandy path that cut through the bushes and led down to the open beach. As Risa led Hioki down this path and onto the sand, she quickly realized she had a very big problem. There was virtually no moonlight. The sky was overcast, and it was basically pitch black out on the beach. This was a huge issue. Remember, she had put out that blue blanket to mark the exact spot where she and Hioki needed to be. It was their position marker, so that her friends, who were hidden nearby in the bushes, would know when and where to light off the fireworks. The entire plan, the entire surprise, was contingent on them getting to that blue blanket. And it was so dark that not only was Risa unable to see the blue blanket from a distance, she could barely even see the sand right in front of her feet. It was so dark, it was almost eerie out there. And you have to remember, this was in 2011. You couldn't just pull out your cell phone and turn on a powerful flashlight. That feature didn't really exist yet. So the best they could do was to pull out their phones, tap on the screen to wake them up, and use the little bit of light coming from the home screen to try and guide their way. After walking on the beach for just a short ways, Hioki actually stopped Risa. He said, "Hey, I don't think it's safe to be walking on the beach right now. We really can't see where we're going at all. Let's go back to the car and see if we have a flashlight." But Risa knew her friends were already in position. They were waiting in those shrubs down the beach, ready to light off those fireworks. And she figured they probably couldn't see very well either. She started to worry that if she and Hioki didn't get to the spot soon, her friends might panic. Maybe they'd think something was wrong, or maybe they'd light off the fireworks prematurely. She didn't know what might happen, but she was starting to get worried that her whole perfect plan was falling apart. She couldn't afford to be late. And so she told her husband, "No, let's not go back for flashlights. Let's just keep walking. It's no big deal. The sand is flat." And so the two of them continued walking along the beach, holding up their dimly lit cell phone screens to try and guide them. But pretty quickly, Hioki started to notice that Risa seemed really anxious, and she was walking way too fast. This was supposed to be a peaceful, romantic walk on the beach, but Risa was walking like a woman on a mission. She was striding ahead of him, clearly trying to get somewhere specific. But he didn't understand where she was trying to go. Finally, he called out to her and said, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you walking so quickly? What are we doing out here?" And so finally, she just stopped. She turned and looked at her husband, and she was about to tell him what was actually going on. She felt like the surprise was ruined at this point anyway, and she basically needed his help if they were ever going to find this blanket and figure out where they needed to be. But right as Risa opened her mouth to tell her husband what was going on, suddenly, it was like the whole world went completely black. There was no more ambient light from their cell phones, no more minimal moonlight, nothing. Just absolute blackness and then a sudden, jarring silence. At that exact same time, Risa's friends were not that far away, hiding up in the bushes just like they had planned. But, much like Risa and Hioki, they had also been dealing with the problem of not being able to see anything. It was so incredibly dark. They had gotten into position, but they couldn't even see the sand clearly from where they were hiding. They had absolutely no idea if Risa and Hioki were in position or not. But they could hear them. They could hear the faint sound of Risa and Hioki talking, somewhere out there on the sand in the darkness. The friends were whispering back and forth to each other in the bushes. How are we going to know when they're actually in position? How are we going to get the signal to light off the fireworks? We can't see them at all, and so the friends were feeling really unsure about what to do. They were straining their eyes, peering out onto the dark sand, trying to see Risa, trying to see Hioki. But again, they couldn't see them. They couldn't even see the blue blanket that they knew wasn't that far away. And so they were just looking and listening, and they could kind of tell that the voices they were hearing were probably Risa and Hioki. And it sounded like they were moving in their general direction. But then, suddenly, they heard screams. The screams were coming from the same direction as the voices they believed were their friends. At first, for just a split second, they thought the screams might actually be the signal. Like a loud, crazy signal to light off the fireworks. But the screams didn't sound happy. They sounded like somebody was in serious trouble. And critically, as soon as the screaming started, it abruptly stopped. It was just a couple of high-pitched, awful screams, and then total silence. Absolute, total silence on the beach. And again, they couldn't see anything. So, they had no idea what was going on. They didn't even know for sure if that was Risa and Hioki, but they had a terrible feeling that something was wrong. So, they abandoned the fireworks plan completely. They left their hiding spot in the bushes and they charged out onto the beach. They were looking all around, shouting their friends' names, but they still really couldn't see anything. They couldn't even find the blue blanket, and they knew roughly where it was supposed to be. And so, they're running around the beach in the dark. They're calling out for Hioki and Risa, but they're not hearing anything back. For a full 30 minutes, they were just running around in a panic, looking for their friends, just knowing in their gut that something bad had just happened. And then, at some point, one of the friends doubled back. They went roughly to the area where they knew the blue blanket was supposed to be. And that's when they made a discovery. It would turn out that when Risa and Hioki were out on that beach, walking around in the total darkness, Risa actually did find the blue sheet that she had set up. Except it was so dark that even though they were, at one point, literally standing on the blanket, she and Hioki couldn't even tell it was that dark. Now, that might not seem like it would be catastrophic until you consider what was underneath that blanket. So, 2 days earlier, when Risa had her big epiphany about how to create the best birthday ever for Hioki, she had been inspired in part by the show they were watching on TV. That hidden camera comedy show that she and Hioki both loved. The show was called Arashi's Big Secret, and its comedy really came from the over-the-top pranks that the show's hosts would pull on Japanese celebrities. And one of those pranks, a recurring one, was to dig a large hole on the beach, cover it up, and then trick somebody into accidentally falling into it. And so Risa thought, what a great idea. What if I dig a hole on the beach, cover it up, and then after our romantic walk, I'll have Hioki fall into the hole as a funny prank. And then my friends will immediately fire off those fireworks. It'll be like he's on the game show that we love so much. It was supposed to be a perfect combination of a romantic, fun time on the beach, a harmless prank, and then a big birthday celebration afterwards. It was, in her mind, the perfect plan. However, Risa had made a terrible, fatal miscalculation. On the game show, when they would dig these holes in the beach, they would cover them with a very specific material. It was basically dried foam, almost like styrofoam. The instant one of their contestants or celebrities stepped directly on the foam, it would immediately break and they would fall safely, feet first, into the hole. But what Risa did was different. After she and her friends dug this deep hole, getting ready for the big party, she covered it first with a thick, rigid piece of plastic. It was almost like a thin sheet of plywood, but made of hard plastic. So she covered the hole with that, and that was the platform. And then she covered that platform with the blue sheet so that to the naked eye, it just looked like the ground was level underneath. In Risa's mind, this rigid piece of plastic would break the instant her husband stepped on it. She thought it wasn't that strong. Maybe it was strong enough to hold him for a second, but it would definitely snap in the middle and he would fall in, just like on the show. But in reality, when she and her husband inadvertently walked onto that blue sheet without even realizing it because it was so dark, that piece of plastic didn't break. It was too rigid. Instead of breaking, the plastic just suddenly tilted to one side. It acted like a trapdoor. This caused both Risa and her husband to suddenly tumble forward, both of them headfirst into this deep hole. And as they fell, their weight on the edge of the hole caused a massive avalanche of sand to pour in from all sides, completely covering the two of them up. And so Risa and Hioki, they screamed for just a second as they began to fall into the ground. And then suddenly, they were upside down and completely buried all the way to the top by heavy, wet sand. That's why it went silent after the screams. It was because they were completely buried alive. Risa's friends, after searching the beach after hearing those screams, they would eventually find the blue blanket. It was partially submerged in the sand. They really didn't know what had happened, but because of the screams and what they were now seeing, they just immediately called the authorities. When the emergency crews came out to the beach, it would take them nearly 30 minutes to finally dig Risa and Hioki out from that hole. But by that point, it was far too late. They had both suffocated to death. One morning, in the winter of 1856, a 27-year-old explorer named Dr. Edward Fogel sat down for breakfast. He was at the home where he was staying in the city of Abashir, which was in a kingdom called Wadai in Central Africa. Edward poured himself a cup of milk, and then, even though the table in front of him was full of warm breads and cakes and porridge, Edward called a servant over. He asked her to please get him a plate of boiled eggs. But the servant just apologized and explained, "I'm very sorry, but we don't have any eggs this morning. We are all out." Edward was disappointed, but he just thanked the servant anyway, and she left. Edward was visiting Africa from his home country of Germany. He was on a map-making expedition, and he'd been staying in Abashir for the past 2 weeks. So far, all the local food he had tried really upset his stomach. Everything except for eggs. So, for literally every single meal since he had arrived, the only thing he would eat was eggs. And now, because they were out of eggs, despite there being all this other perfectly good food to choose from, he knew he couldn't eat it without getting sick. And so, he would just have to go hungry. But outside of the food issue, overall, Edward thought the city of Abashir was okay. He had been given the chance to meet the king, who had then arranged for him to stay in this very nice home that was owned by a local noble family. And the area itself was extremely beautiful. Edward was on track to be the very first European to successfully make a detailed map of it, which meant that he would essentially be creating history. But Edward just really was not getting along with the local people. They seemed to him to be kind of suspicious of him for no reason, and Edward couldn't believe it. They didn't seem to care at all that he was this famous map maker who had come all the way there from Germany to literally put their, what he considered to be, insignificant city onto the map of the whole world. Why didn't they appreciate that? He just couldn't understand it. And now, adding insult to injury, Edward couldn't even eat any breakfast. And so, feeling pretty annoyed, despite all the effort the family had clearly made to feed him that morning, Edward stood up from the table and he left to go spend the day exploring. He walked out into the front courtyard of the home, where another servant was waiting with Edward's horse. Edward spent most of his days in the city just kind of riding around and drawing maps of the streets and the alleyways. But today, this servant warned Edward that he really ought to stay inside. The servant told him it was not safe for him to go out into the city today. At this point in time, the kingdom that Abashir was a part of was at war with several neighboring nations. And so, as a result, everybody in the city was very worried about spies. This meant they were extremely suspicious of any foreigners, like Edward. Now, for the most part, the locals had sort of put up with his presence so far, but to them, it just seemed like he was always watching them, always writing in his notebook, but never talking to anyone. And so they had started to gossip about him. But Edward, after being given this warning by the servant, did not take it seriously at all. Instead, he kind of scoffed and said, it's no big deal. I'm not going to be out there for very long anyways. Nothing's going to happen. He then told the servant that he had another plan for the day. His big plan was to leave the city of Abashir and go to this nearby mountain. He wanted to climb up the mountain and get a bird's-eye view of the entire city from the top to help him finish his map. But when Edward said that, the servant looked truly horrified. He told Edward that he simply could not do that because the mountain Edward was clearly talking about was sacred. Nobody was allowed to climb it. It was a very important rule to the people who lived there. But to Edward, this warning didn't land at all. Instead, he just saw it as more evidence that the locals just didn't appreciate what he was doing for them. He was on a very important mission, a mission that was, in his mind, far more important than anything that was sacred to them. And so Edward, he thanked the servant for the warning, but also basically said, look, I'm going to do what I'm going to do because this is really important. And so he said, I'm going to go hike that mountain and I'll see you tonight when I drop off the horse. And then Edward climbed onto the horse and he rode off. But Edward didn't come back. He didn't come back that night, or the day after, or the day after that. And pretty soon, it became very clear that Edward Fogel was missing. Word of Edward's disappearance ultimately made it back to Germany pretty quickly, specifically to the Geography Society that had sent him to Africa on this map-making mission in the first place. So the Geography Society and the German public were very concerned, and they sent several search parties to Africa to go look for Edward. But despite multiple serious attempts over several years, nobody ever found him or figured out what happened to him. And because of this, Edward sort of became famous back in Germany. People began to see him as this brave explorer who thirsted for knowledge and went daringly into the unknown. They imagined all sorts of dramatic and tragic things that might have happened to him. Maybe he had been assassinated by a rival kingdom or taken prisoner. Or maybe he discovered something holy or ancient that he wasn't supposed to see. And so, in time, the story of Edward Fogel got bigger and bigger. He became like a symbol of German pride. This was our great explorer. He had done something amazing, clearly. Also adding intrigue to this already very bizarre mystery was the fact that all of the people who actually went to Africa to look for Edward, all the members of those search parties over the years, literally every single one of them died. Now, we know how those searchers died. It was due to local violence or disease or just plain bad luck. But it sort of added to the intrigue of this mystery. The idea that everybody who went looking for Edward didn't come back, that became part of the lore. And so this mystery just continued to grow and grow. It was passed around and things were embellished and things were fictionalized until finally, almost 20 years after Edward disappeared, another explorer named Gustav Nachtigall decided that he was going to be the one who finally figured out, once and for all, what actually happened to this guy. And so, in the early winter of 1874, Gustav is now in the courtyard outside of his apartment in Abashir. He had actually traveled to Africa to begin his search for the answer. What happened to Edward? And he's standing in this courtyard along with his translator, whose name was Ahmed. The two of them were sitting across from an elderly man who was friends with the current king of Abashir. This elderly man had, at one point, lived in one of the apartments across this very courtyard. And so Gustav asked this old man if he had ever met with a European man about 17 years earlier. And Ahmed translated the question for him. And the old man said, yes, he had. He remembered that one European man had come to meet with the king around that time. He said the man had always been writing in this notebook, but he had never seemed to want to speak to anybody and had, for the most part, just kept to himself. But the old man said that, beyond his general impression of the guy, he really didn't know anything about him. He had no idea what he was doing there or what ultimately happened to him. So at this point, both Gustav and Ahmed had been in Abashir for 2 months. And in that time, they had been trying to ask around and see if anybody remembered Edward. And so far, they had run into a few people who did seem to remember him, like this older man, because it was pretty rare to see a European person in the city. But unfortunately, nobody had any specific information on how or when Edward had disappeared. Or, in the rare case that they did seem to know more, they refused to talk about it. And so for Gustav, on the one hand, This was incredibly frustrating. All he wanted was the truth. But on the other hand, as he ran into more and more people who seemed apprehensive to even talk about Edward at all, that sort of suggested that maybe something really bad did happen to Edward when he was in Abashir. And if that was the case, if some horrible fate befell him, Gustav knew there was one person in this city who almost certainly would know the truth. But Gustav basically couldn't ask this one person any questions about Edward without being incredibly offensive. Because this one person was the current king of Abashir, King Ali. And it would have been his father who had met Edward and arranged for him to stay with that noble family when he was doing his map-making. And so, for Edward to have been killed or captured, or if something horrible had happened to him while he was in Abashir, well, King Ali's father would have had to have given the okay. Or he would have at least known about it and been okay with it. He would have known something, making him complicit in whatever happened to Edward. And so to ask King Ali, hey, what do you think happened to Edward? You could be potentially suggesting that his own father did something terrible. But it was more than that. What Ahmed had told Gustav was that you don't just risk offending the king by asking those questions. You might actually be executed for offending the king. And so, what Gustav decided he needed to do, because he was so dead set on trying to solve this mystery, is he still needed to find a way to talk to King Ali about Edward, but without losing his life. He had to come up with a very clever way to get this information out of the king. A few weeks later, Gustav and Ahmed had still not yet come up with a clever way to speak to the king. They couldn't figure out a way to approach the subject without horribly offending him. And so the two of them were in Gustav's apartment eating lunch when suddenly there was a knock at the door. Gustav got up, he went to the door, and when he opened it up, it was a courier. The man told Gustav that he was part of a caravan that had just arrived there from North Africa, and he had some mail for Gustav from back home. He had letters from Germany. He just handed the whole bundle of mail to Gustav. And Gustav, who did not get mail very often, was very excited. He said, "Oh, thank you." He took the mail, thanked the guy again, shut the door, and went back into the common room. And he just began going through the mail, looking to see who had sent him something. And as he was doing it, he suddenly had this great idea. It had nothing to do with what was actually written in the letters. It was just the concept of receiving mail that suddenly gave him this brilliant way to talk to the king. The very next day, Gustav and Ahmed walked into the royal palace in Abashir. When they walked in, they eventually made their way into this bright and airy courtroom. And in this courtroom, on the other end, against the far wall, was King Ali sitting on his throne. So Gustav and Ahmed immediately went over to the king, and they greeted him and they exchanged some pleasantries. And as they were doing that, Gustav, he knew that that same caravan that had come through the day before with his mail had also made a stop at the palace. He knew they had presented the king with all these lavish gifts like a silver tea set and gold watches and all this luxurious fabric. And so Gustav was really hoping that those gifts had put the king in a really good mood, because that was a big part of his plan. At some point, after the pleasantries had stopped, Gustav actually referenced the caravan. He told the king that, in fact, they had also swung by his place and dropped off this big bundle of letters from back home. And he said he was really happy about it. And the king kind of seconded that and said, "Oh yeah, they gave me all these great gifts." Yes, it was so wonderful. And so they're kind of talking back and forth about how great this mail delivery was when Gustav tells this incredible lie to the king. He tells the king, he goes, "You know, all those letters, it was really great to hear from home, from my friends, from my family. But there was this one really weird letter in there that I didn't even know who it was from." Now, this letter didn't exist. This was a total fabrication. But he told the king that this weird letter, it was from an elderly man who had written to Gustav to tell him that his son had gone to Abashir many years ago and had never come home again. And so now, this elderly man, he knew his son was probably not alive at this point, but in this fictional letter to Gustav, he told Gustav that his son had done a lot of writing in notebooks. And he was hopeful that maybe someone in Abashir still had these notebooks. And could Gustav please get the notebooks and return them to the old man just to give him some comfort about what his son had been doing and saying and thinking before he disappeared. As soon as Gustav said this, he could actually feel the mood in the throne room shift. He could tell that King Ali was very much on edge about what Gustav might say next. But Gustav had planned for this. And he told the king that, just so you know, all throughout Europe, people think of you as a wise and just king. And so, if by chance you have these notebooks and you were to give them to me so I can give them to this elderly man in his old age so he can have some comfort before he dies, if you would do that, the people of Europe would love you even more for that simple act of kindness. Then Gustav went quiet, and there was this really intense silence in the throne room. But then the king just kind of sat back in his throne and he smiled at Gustav. And as soon as Gustav saw that smile on the king's face, he decided he just had to do it. And he said to the king, "The son's name is Dr. Edward Fogel." And then after that, Gustav just went silent. Because he knew at this point, if the king thought he was lying or trying to trick him, he could easily be executed right here, right now. But King Ali just kept on smiling at Gustav and just said, "You know what? I will think about it." Gustav quickly thanked the king and hurried out of the throne room. And then he went back to his apartment and spent the entire night just pacing around his room, wondering what was going to happen. Part of Gustav was optimistic that maybe the king would come through here and hand over these notebooks if he really did have them. But the other part of Gustav, the more realistic side, thought that maybe what he had just done was effectively sign his own death warrant, and that soon he'd become one of the many travelers who came to Abashir and never went home. A few days later, a very nervous Gustav followed a palace guard back into the throne room. And when he got in there, he immediately saw King Ali sitting on his throne. And Gustav really couldn't read his expression. So he didn't know if the king was mad at him, if he was going to be conciliatory, if he was going to help him. He had no idea. And so Gustav just walked into the room and kind of held his breath. King Ali broke the silence. And when he did, it was clear he was not angry. He was just kind of even-keeled. And he told Gustav that after their conversation, he had gone and spoken to the noble family that Edward had stayed with when he was here. But they told him they couldn't find any of Dr. Edward's writings. They said the notebooks had either been thrown away or lost. And so, unfortunately, there was nothing to send back to Edward's elderly father. Now, Gustav did not believe this for a second. At this time, paper was very scarce. There was no way they would have been just throwing it away or destroying it. Paper was pretty valuable. But he couldn't say that to the king. So he just swallowed his disappointment and thanked the king for asking about the notebooks. And then Gustav hoped that at this point he'd be allowed to leave. But one of the guards put their hand on Gustav's shoulder and said he needed to follow him. And at this point, Gustav's stomach dropped. He assumed he was about to be taken away, to be punished for asking about Edward in the first place. And so Gustav's hands were shaking and his heart was racing as he followed the guard out of the palace and out into the courtyard. There were some horses tied up and waiting for them. Gustav felt nauseous as he followed the guard through the city streets, and he wondered if he should just try to make a break for it and try to escape. But he looked down different streets and alleys and realized that would be totally useless. The palace guards would find him in minutes. So there was nowhere for him to go. And so Gustav had no choice but to just keep on following this guard. Through the city they went. And then eventually they got to the city gates. And Gustav was horrified as they left the city and just began riding out into the wilderness over towards this huge mountain in the distance. And as they were making their way towards this mountain, all Gustav was thinking is that at any moment here, they're going to just dump me here to die, or they're going to ambush me, or something bad is going to happen. At some point, the guard led Gustav all the way to the foot of that mountain. And there, the guard abruptly stopped and climbed off his horse. He just turned around and faced Gustav. And he says, "I am going to tell you exactly what happened to Edward." And Gustav was kind of shocked by this. He really didn't know what was going to happen here. He didn't even know if he was still in danger at this point. But now he was just holding his breath, waiting for this mystery to potentially finally be solved. And so the guard, he looked at Gustav and he said, Edward committed an unforgivable crime. And he was punished for that crime. Now, at this point, Gustav was shocked. Edward was this very well-traveled and highly respected guy. And it just didn't make sense that he would commit any crime, let alone an unforgivable one that apparently cost him his life. And so Gustav kind of blurted out, what crime? What did he do? The guard explained that from day one, Edward had made lots of enemies in Abbashir. He basically spent his days riding all around the city and staring at everybody and writing in his notebooks, but never talking to anybody. And so people began to gossip that maybe he was a spy. And then also, the guard said Edward had climbed their sacred mountain despite being told not to, the mountain that was literally right behind them. And then also, the guard said Edward was just totally unpleasant and just kind of a snobby person that nobody liked. But the guard said, none of that is actually what caused Edward to be punished. Edward's unforgivable crime, the one that caused his downfall, was his insatiable hunger for eggs. At every single meal, he refused all the food his noble host prepared for him and demanded eggs. In Abbashir, eggs were quite rare and were considered a precious gift. And Edward demanded them at every single meal, and he ate all of that noble family's eggs. And so eventually, the nobles, they could not stand Edward's disrespect. And so they went to the king. And the king, who agreed this was just awful what Edward had done, decided the only appropriate punishment was to take Edward and drag him out to the base of that sacred mountain and literally beat him to death. Dr. Edward Vogel, the proud symbol of Germany's exploring spirit, was executed because he ate an offensive number of eggs. Gustav was unharmed. He, unlike Edward, had actually bothered to learn the local customs and was highly respectful. And so he was allowed to leave the city even after being told what happened to Edward. And he would become the first European ever to leave Abbashir alive. As for Edward's notebooks and maps, they were never found. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the 2nd of August 1963, the Penkman family was filled with the kind of simple excitement that marks the beginning of a summer adventure. The family, a tight-knit group of 5, packed up their car and headed off to a camping resort nestled by the serene, deep lake in Washington state. There was Mr. and Mrs. Penkman and their 3 sons. 10-year-old Bill, the responsible older brother, 6-year-old Jimmy, full of energy and curiosity. And then there was 4-year-old Bobby, the youngest, who was going through a classic toddler phase of refusing to wear shoes. For him, the feel of the earth beneath his feet was a freedom he wasn't willing to give up. The first day at the campsite was perfect. They settled in, the boys explored the immediate area around their tent, and the parents, Edna and her husband, relaxed, happy to be away from the daily routine. The following day, August 3rd, started out just as promising. After breakfast, Edna had an idea. She had heard from other campers about a logging road just behind their campsite. It was supposed to lead to a beautiful little waterfall, a hidden gem she thought her boys would absolutely love to see. It sounded like the perfect little morning excursion. So, Edna got the boys ready. She told her husband she was taking them for a short walk to see the waterfall and that they wouldn't be long. He waved them off, and Edna, with Bill, Jimmy, and shoeless little Bobby, started down the path. As soon as they stepped onto the logging road, however, Edna realized the descriptions might have been a bit romanticized. The road was completely overgrown. The grass was tall, tickling their legs as they walked. The ground was uneven, a mix of rocks and bumpy dirt that had been reclaimed by nature. It was immediately clear to her that no vehicle had driven down this road in a very, very long time. This wasn't just a quiet spot. It was truly isolated. The thought was a little unsettling, but also part of the appeal of being out in the wilderness. They continued their walk, the boys chattering, enjoying the adventure of the untamed path. After a little while, they spotted a small turnoff, a less defined path that seemed to lead down towards the sound of water. This had to be the way to the waterfall. But as they got closer, Edna saw that the path was choked with thick brush, and the ground looked even rougher than the road had been. This was going to be a problem for Bobby. His bare feet had been fine on the packed dirt of the road, but this terrain of sharp sticks and rocks was too much for a 4-year-old. Edna made a quick decision. She turned to her youngest son and said, "Bobby, you need to wait here on the road for a minute." She then looked at 6-year-old Jimmy. "You stay with him. Keep him company." The plan was simple. She and Bill, the oldest, would push through the brush, go down to the water, and quickly check out the waterfall. It would only take a couple of minutes. Then she'd come right back, pick up Bobby, and they could all go down together. Bobby didn't seem to mind at all. He just sat down on the relatively clear patch of the road, perfectly content. Jimmy, on the other hand, was a little frustrated. He wanted to be in the first group, to see the waterfall with his big brother and his mom. But he did as he was told and sat down next to Bobby. And so Edna and Bill pushed past the thicket of brush and made their way down the short slope to the water's edge. Now, it's important to understand the layout here. The distance between where Edna and Bill stood by the waterfall and where Bobby and Jimmy sat on the road was only about 10 feet. It was an incredibly short distance. The only thing separating them was that dense patch of brush, which did completely obscure their view of each other. They couldn't see the boys, and the boys couldn't see them. But they were so close, they could have easily heard a shout, a cry, or any unusual noise. As Edna and Bill looked at the small cascade of water, Jimmy was sitting next to his little brother, getting more and more restless by the second. He could hear the water, he could hear his mom and brother talking, and he just couldn't stand being left out. The wait felt like an eternity to a 6-year-old. At some point, his patience just ran out. He couldn't take it anymore. And in that moment, Jimmy made a choice that he would carry with him a heavy weight of regret for the rest of his life. He stood up, and he left his little brother sitting there all alone. Jimmy scrambled through the brush, emerging by the water where his mom and Bill were. As soon as Edna saw him, she was annoyed. She looked at him sternly and said, "What are you doing? You left Bobby up there all by himself. Come on." She didn't waste another second. They had only been down by the water for about 60 seconds in total. A single minute. She turned right around, with Bill and Jimmy in tow, and they all pushed back through the brush and up onto the road. And when they got back, Bobby was gone. At first, there was no real alarm. The immediate thought wasn't that something terrible had happened. It couldn't have. They were in the middle of nowhere. They hadn't seen another person all morning. They hadn't heard a single sound other than their own voices and the birds. Edna's first reaction was simple annoyance, mostly directed at Jimmy for not staying put. She assumed Bobby had gotten up to wander. Maybe he was hiding behind a tree, playing a little game. Or perhaps he'd just walked a few feet down the hill. So they started calling for him. "Bobby? Where are you?" They walked around the immediate area, peering behind trees and into the tall grass. No one was panicking yet. It was just an inconvenience, a brief delay in their morning walk. But after a couple of minutes of calling his name with no response, a small seed of worry began to sprout. Bobby wasn't answering. They couldn't see him anywhere. The annoyance started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Edna began to feel a knot tightening in her stomach. She started yelling louder, her voice now edged with panic. She sent Bill and Jimmy to look down by the water again to check every possible spot, but there was absolutely no trace of him. It just didn't make any sense. He was 4 years old. He had no shoes on. He couldn't have gone far in such a short amount of time. And how could he have disappeared without them hearing anything? He was just gone. The panic was now in full bloom. After a few more frantic minutes of searching the same small area over and over, Edna knew this was a situation she couldn't handle on her own. She gathered her other two boys, their faces pale with confusion and fear, and they ran. They ran as fast as they could all the way back down the overgrown logging road to the campsite. They burst into the camp, and Edna frantically explained to her husband what had happened. They immediately got help and called the police. Very quickly, a massive search operation was launched on that lonely logging road. When the police arrived, the first thing they did was sit down with Edna, Bill, and Jimmy. They pressed them, gently but firmly, about what they had heard. "You had to have heard something," the officers explained. "He was only 10 feet away from you. He was definitely within earshot. Did you hear a car? An animal? Did you hear anyone talking? Anything at all?" But Edna and the boys could only shake their heads, their expressions a mixture of bafflement and terror. They swore up and down that they had heard nothing. The woods had been completely silent. They were just as confused as anyone else. This left the police with a very difficult starting point. They had no idea where Bobby could have gone. They carefully surveyed the area. There were no steep cliffs or drop-offs nearby. No obvious places a small child could have fallen into or become trapped. The waterfall itself fed into a tiny, shallow brook. It would be difficult for anyone, let alone a 4-year-old, to drown in it. With no clues to go on, the searchers had no choice but to simply fan out in all directions, a combing operation through the dense woods, hoping to find a piece of clothing, a footprint, or any other sign that would tell them which way he went. For 3 long, agonizing days, hundreds of searchers scoured the forest. They found nothing. Finally, they decided to bring in a bloodhound to try and track Bobby by his scent. They brought one of Bobby's shoes from the campsite for the dog to smell. The moment the dog was given the scent, it seemed to lock on immediately. It got very excited, its nose to the ground, and started pulling the handler right near the area where Bobby had last been seen. Then the dog turned and started running up the logging road away from the campsite deeper into the forest. It ran for nearly 2 miles, never seeming to lose the scent. It was clearly and confidently tracking Bobby. The dog finally stopped at a fork in the road, about 2 miles from where Bobby had disappeared. It keyed in on one specific area right at the fork. It was just a bare patch of dirt. There was nothing significant about it at all. The police were hopeful. They dug into the dirt a little, but there was nothing there. They scanned the entire area looking for any sign that Bobby had been there, but there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded items. They brought the dog back a little way and gave it the scent again. And again, the dog went right back to that exact same patch of dirt at the fork in the road and refused to move on. The dog was certain the trail ended there, but the investigators didn't know what to do with that information. It was a dead end with no explanation. After 7 days of exhaustive searching that yielded absolutely nothing, the search for Bobby Pankman was officially called off. The lead investigator held a press conference. His face was grim as he told the reporters that they had no idea what had happened to Bobby. However, he stated that they did believe he was abducted. His reasoning was straightforward and logical. Bobby was a very young child with no shoes on, in a forest he didn't know. He was out of his mother's sight for, at most, 2 minutes. How far could he have really gotten on his own in that time? Certainly not far enough that his family and a massive search party wouldn't have found him. But if you go down the abduction theory, you run into a whole new set of problems. For a person to have taken Bobby, that person had to be on that extremely isolated, overgrown logging road at that exact moment. The Pankmans hadn't seen anyone else the entire time they were there. And there were very few other campers at the resort. This suggests that if a person did abduct Bobby, they must have been planning it. They would have had Ohat been hiding in the trees, stalking the family, waiting for an opportunity. And then you have to consider the opportunity itself. It was a tiny 2-minute window that opened up completely by chance when Jimmy decided to leave his brother's side. It wasn't an obvious moment. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which you would think would have been a deterrent to any would-be kidnapper. But as soon as that window presented itself, this person would have had to run out from the tree line, run over to Bobby, pick him up without Bobby making a single sound, muffle him somehow, and then run away back into the woods carrying a child, all within that 2-minute time frame. It just seemed like the person who could do that would need to be incredibly fixated on Bobby specifically, and there was no reason for anyone to be. And two, they would need to be extraordinarily strong, fast, and agile. We're talking about someone with the physical fitness of a professional athlete. While it's certainly possible that a highly athletic individual had been stalking this family and executed a flawless, silent abduction in a tiny window of opportunity and then evaded a massive search for 7 days in the woods, it just seemed incredibly unlikely. Investigators reached this same conclusion. They thought the human abduction theory, while the most likely, was still full of holes. So they moved on to considering animals. Maybe a bear had taken Bobby. They brought in specialized bear-sniffing dogs to search the area for any signs of recent bear activity. The dogs found nothing. So they moved on. Okay, maybe it was a cougar. They brought in a cougar expert to examine the area. The expert found no tracks, no scat, no signs of a cougar anywhere nearby. Plus, a key piece of evidence was missing for a large predator attack. There was no blood anywhere, and there were no drag marks in the dirt. If a predator were to grab a child, it would have to drag them away, and that would leave a very clear trail. There was none. With the large predator theory also seeming unlikely, someone offered up another idea. Maybe a giant eagle had swooped down, picked Bobby up, and flown away with him. This would account for the silence, the lack of drag marks, and the lack of blood. It would explain why he just vanished. But that was the point when authorities knew they were grasping at straws. They had no clue what had happened. And that's why the investigator at the press release basically said, "We just don't know." And so while we will probably never know for sure what happened to 4-year-old Bobby Pankman, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent. It was fast, strong, and agile. And it had been watching that family because as soon as that 2-minute window of vulnerability presented itself, it swept in so fast and so silently that no one saw it, no one heard it, and it took Bobby somewhere. And whatever it did to him, it probably wasn't good. In December of 1961, James McCormack Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. He was the kind of man who couldn't sit still for long. He was feeling bored and restless and decided he wanted to do something fun with his 16-year-old son, James McCormack Jr. The two of them were very close and shared a love for the outdoors. They were both avid and experienced hunters. So they settled on going hunting together. They chose Larch Mountain as their destination. Even though it was only about 30 miles from the city, Larch Mountain had a reputation. It was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the entire northwestern United States. On December 4th, the two men, along with their loyal hunting dog, headed out. They arrived at the base of the mountain, excited for the day ahead. They hopped out of their car, put on their gear, and began their hike into the vast wilderness. The weather forecasters had predicted a cold day, with a chance of some light snow, but overall, the weather was supposed to hold. It was just supposed to be a day trip. They planned to be back home by nightfall, so they hadn't brought any equipment for an overnight stay. They had warm clothes, some food, and water, but no tent or shelter. After walking for several hours deep into the mountains, they started to notice a dramatic shift in the weather. The temperature was dropping rapidly, much faster than they had anticipated. Then, a light rain began to fall. And then, within a very short period of time, that rain turned into heavy, wet snow. Initially, they thought they could gut it out. They were tough guys, and they didn't want a little bad weather to ruin their trip. But soon, the snow was coming down so hard and their gear was getting so wet that they decided it was time to call it a day. It was awful, and it was going to get dark soon. So they agreed to turn around and head back to the truck. They could always go hunting another day. But the snow had come on so quickly and was so thick that when they turned around to retrace their steps, the landscape looked completely different. Everything was covered in a fresh, white blanket that disguised all the landmarks they had been using. They didn't have a GPS, of course. They were navigating with a map and compass. And they weren't on a marked trail. They had been bushwhacking, just walking through the mountains looking for a good spot to set up. So they started walking in the direction they believed was back to their vehicle. They made turns they thought were correct, but they soon started to question where they were. After walking for several more hours, they realized they weren't anywhere near a road. They were in an area they didn't recognize at all. And the sinking feeling hit them. They were lost. By this point, it was snowing really hard, and the liquid of the daylight was fading. The pair decided they had no choice. They had to spend the night out in the wilderness. They weren't going to find their vehicle in the dark, especially now. Their best bet was to find a place to camp out for the night and try again in the morning. But remember, they had no tent, no sleeping bags, nothing to protect them from the elements. They decided their best option was to climb up into a large tree. At least that way, they would be off the frozen ground. It would offer some protection from potential predators, and the thick branches of the evergreen would shield them a little bit from the relentless snow and freezing rain. That night was a sleepless, miserable ordeal. James Sr., James Jr., and their dog huddled together in that tree, shivering uncontrollably as they were just destroyed by the storm. The snow and freezing rain never let up, and the wind howled through the branches. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sun came up the next morning. It brought a glimmer of hope, although it was still absolutely dumping snow on them. They were cold and exhausted, but they were still optimistic. They were thinking to themselves, this is going to make one heck of a story when we finally get back home. And so they carefully climbed out of the tree, their limbs stiff and sore. They stretched, trying to get some feeling back into their bodies, and then they began walking again in a direction they hoped would lead them to their vehicle. For several hours, they just trudged through the deep snow, hoping to stumble upon the road. But they didn't. At some point, they stopped, and the reality of their situation hit them once again. They were in the exact same position as the day before. They still had no idea where they were, and now they had potentially walked even farther in the wrong direction. James Sr. pulled out his map, trying to make sense of their location. He was looking at the terrain around them, trying to match it to the contours on the map, looking for any clue about which way they should be going. As he was doing this, his son, who had been a really tough kid up to this point and hadn't complained about anything, said to his dad that he was feeling delirious. He said he felt like he couldn't think straight and that it was even hard for him to stand. He was going to sit down for a minute. At first, his dad wasn't overly concerned. They had just spent a miserable night in a tree. It made sense that his son would be tired and feeling out of it. And they had been well rested before the trip. They had only been out in the elements for one full day. They still had warm clothes, food, and water. He figured his son would just sit down for a minute, catch his breath, and then he'd be rejuvenated and ready to keep moving. So, James Sr. continued to study his map, looking around, waiting for his son to say he was ready to go. But his son just continued to deteriorate. He started speaking in nonsense, and he couldn't get up on his own. This was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel a deep, cold fear for their actual safety. Even the night before, huddled in the tree, it had just felt like a crazy adventure that they would eventually overcome. Even that morning when they woke up and it was still snowing and they were still lost, He had held on to that optimism, and so had his son. But now, he was thinking that they were potentially staring down another night out in the storm. They were going to eventually run out of food and water. Their clothes were getting soaked through. The temperatures were dropping well below freezing. And now, something was seriously wrong with his son. This was concerning on its own, but it also meant that if his son couldn't move, they couldn't make any progress towards getting out of this situation. James Sr. was a very fit man. As a fireman, he was used to physically demanding situations. He looked at his son and said, "Okay, I'm going to pick you up, and I'm going to carry you." He hoisted his son up in a fireman's carry, draping him over his shoulders. And for 3 solid hours, James Sr. just continued to march through the deep snow, carrying his son, desperately looking for the way out. After 3 hours, when they had not gotten any closer to a road or any sign of civilization, and it was now getting dark again, he finally collapsed from exhaustion. He gently put his son down by a tree and sat down next to him, totally defeated. He told his son they had to get ready for another night. They had to get back up in a tree and do it all over again. As they were sitting there, talking about how they were going to get James Jr. up into a tree, since he was now too weak to climb up himself, they both noticed something strange. About 100 feet in front of them, there were 2 very bright lights that looked exactly like headlights. James Sr.'s heart leaped. "Oh my goodness, what luck," he thought. "There's a road right there that we just didn't see, and there's a car parked on it." He turned to his son and said, "I'm going to go up and talk to them, tell them we're stuck out here, and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here, I'll be right back." So, James Sr. got up and started running towards those lights. They were his lifeline. He wanted to get to them before the car potentially pulled away, not realizing there were 2 people in desperate need of help just a few yards away. As he was running, covering 50, 60, 70 feet, he noticed the lights seemed to be moving farther and farther away from him. James Sr. stopped in his tracks. He stood there, panting, looking at these lights and thinking, "Are those really headlights? What are those lights?" And then, at some point, the lights just seemed to drift off into the forest, and then they were gone. James Sr. looked around and realized there was no road over there. He was still in the middle of the deep woods. What were those lights? He stood there for a minute, a wave of confusion and fear washing over him. Was he losing his grip on reality? What was going on? He turned around and started running back to where he had left his son and his dog. But when he got there, only his dog was there. His son was gone. What was going through James Sr.'s mind was, how is this possible? His son couldn't even walk just a few minutes ago. He certainly wouldn't have lied to him and made him carry him all this way. There was just enough light left from the dusk and the reflection off the snow that he could still see footprints on the ground. He saw the backpack his son had left by the tree. He grabbed it, he grabbed his dog, and he started yelling for his son at the top of his lungs. And he started following the single set of footprints that led away from the tree, the footprints that had to have been left by his son. He's walking along these tracks, yelling his son's name, but he's hearing nothing back. And this whole time, he's thinking to himself, why would he even leave? Even if he suddenly could move, why would he leave me? We're in this together. What is going on with my son? He kept walking, following the tracks, but the snow was still coming down so heavily that the prints were getting harder and harder to see. They were filling in with fresh snow almost as fast as he could follow them. Finally, it got completely dark, and he couldn't see the prints at all anymore. Now, James Sr. was absolutely panicked. This was a complete nightmare. Where was his son? What were those strange lights? And now he was facing another night out here, all alone. He just picked a random direction, holding on to his son's belongings with his dog by his side, and he just started running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog stumbled into a lodge. It was about 6 miles away, as the crow flies, from where they had originally parked their car at Larch Mountain. Of course, that doesn't mean they only traveled 6 miles. They had likely zigzagged all over the mountain, covering a much greater distance. It was a miracle that he had found it. He had basically run all night until he hit a road, and then he followed that road until it led him to this lodge. He stumbled inside, hypothermic and exhausted, and told the staff that his son was missing. He told them they had been lost for 2 days, and his son was out there in the middle of the woods, hurt, and they needed to go find him. Very quickly, the police were called. Word spread to the fire department in Portland that the fire inspector's son was missing. In an incredible show of solidarity, 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain to help with the search. The paramedics at the lodge wanted James Sr. to go straight to the hospital. He was in bad shape. But he was not about to leave his son. He refused all medical attention and insisted on going out with the very first group of searchers. Somehow, in his exhausted and disoriented state, he was able to lead them back to the rough area where his son had been sitting when he disappeared. They began to search that area, and very quickly they found James Jr.'s glasses case. A little farther on, they found his boots and his socks just sitting in the snow. But there was no sign of James Jr. himself. Later that day, though, they would find him. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and glasses case were found. He was at the bottom of a cliff, and he was deceased. Initially, the searchers thought the story was straightforward. He must have gotten confused, wandered away from where his dad told him to sit, and tragically fallen off the cliff. But the medical examiner determined that he did not die from the fall. The evidence showed he had made his way down to the base of that cliff and then died of exposure. This left everyone with a series of baffling questions. How was James Jr. suddenly able to walk again after being so weak he had to be carried? And once he regained that ability, why didn't he go towards his dad or call out for him? Why did he walk away from him? And perhaps most strangely, why did he take his shoes and socks off in a blizzard to do it? And what were those mysterious lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? They weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that his son suddenly got up and walked away into the storm. In early July of 1953, the Huggen family was preparing for a long-awaited summer vacation. Mr. and Mrs. Huggen, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week retreat. They were heading to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario. This wasn't a bustling tourist town. Wade was, and still is, one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was situated right in the middle of a huge, swampy forest, and it wasn't far from one of the biggest lakes in the area, a body of water called Fox Lake. The family arrived late in the evening on July 4th. After the long drive, they were too tired to do much of anything. They just unpacked the essentials, got the girls settled, and went to bed, dreaming of the weeks of relaxation and adventure ahead. Early the next morning, the adults in the cabin decided they wanted to take the girls down to Fox Lake for the day. So they began the busy process of gathering all the supplies they would need, towels, snacks, fishing gear, and everything else for a full day by the water. While the adults were busy packing, the 3 girls were allowed to play outside the cabin. It was a completely safe environment, or so they thought. There were no neighbors for miles around. The cabin was an isolated outpost in the wilderness. It was totally normal to let the children play by themselves just outside the door. They weren't concerned about someone taking them. The 2 older girls played together in the front yard of the cabin. 5-year-old Geraldine, the youngest, was playing by herself on the side of the cabin. This meant the 2 girls in the front couldn't see Geraldine, and she couldn't see them. The adults were keeping a general eye on all 3 girls. They were mostly going in and out of the cabin, grabbing things for their trip, and they would periodically poke their heads out the windows or the door to check on them. And every time they looked, the girls were fine, happily playing in the morning sun. At around 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car. They were ready to go. They went outside to collect the girls to head over to the lake. They gathered the two older girls who were playing out front, and then they walked around to the side of the house to get Geraldine. But they couldn't find her. At this initial moment, they weren't worried. She was a 5-year-old. Where could she have possibly gone? They walked around the entire house, calling her name. Geraldine? They asked the two older girls if they had seen her, where she had gone. And they just said they didn't know, that she was just playing on the side of the house a minute ago. When they couldn't find her outside, they went back into the cabin, thinking she must have slipped inside without them noticing. That seemed to be the only other place she could possibly be. But after a thorough search of the small cabin, looking under beds and in closets, and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults started talking to each other, trying to establish a timeline. Did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her recently? And they all said yes. They had all poked their heads out a window or a door at some point and had seen her playing right on the side of the cabin within the last 10 minutes. They all agreed on this. In the last 10 minutes, she was right there. So now they were alarmed. They couldn't find her, but they were still thinking they were going to find her any second. They went back outside and began looking around again, this time yelling for her with more urgency. Now, this was such a remote section of Ontario that there was virtually no noise pollution. Sound travels incredibly well out there. When they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. Even if Geraldine had sprinted as fast as her little legs could carry her for 10 solid minutes away from the cabin, she still would have been easily within earshot. All she had to do was yell back, and they would have heard her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. At this point, the family was panicking. They called the police. When the police showed up, they took one look at the vast, dense wilderness surrounding the cabin and knew they were going to need a lot more help. They weren't going to be able to search this area effectively on their own. This was a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. So they called in some professional trackers, local men who were intimately familiar with this rugged terrain to come and help them. They also called the army base in Winnipeg to send over some soldiers to assist in the search as well. But just as the search was getting organized and underway, the skies opened up. A torrential downpour began, dumping rain all over the entire area. It basically washed away any footprints or tracks that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set, there was still no sign of Geraldine. Her father, his heart breaking, said something to the searchers that was intended to help them, but it was just an incredibly sad comment. He told them that his daughter was terrified of the dark, and that once it got dark out in these woods, she would be too scared to move. She would just sit down and cry. He was hoping this meant she wouldn't wander farther away and that they would be able to find her. But they didn't find her that night. For 3 days, they looked everywhere for her. Hundreds of people combed the woods. There was no trace of her at all. And to make matters even worse, the weather had turned really rainy and cold. The temperatures weren't below freezing, but they were close, down in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And Geraldine was only wearing a light shirt and shorts. She was not prepared for this kind of weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they finally found a clue. They found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's. They were high up on a mossy ledge that overlooked Fox Lake. The footprints indicated that a small child, probably Geraldine, had stood there looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swampy area below. Her footprints then dissipated into the muck and water of the swamp. So the entire search effort was now focused on the swamp. They had thousands of people combing through this mosquito-infested, dense bush looking for the little girl. And once again, they found nothing. Then, on the 7th day of the search, they found another set of footprints in the swamp near the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints. These were huge prints. If it was a human print, it would have to belong to an enormous human being. Or the prints belonged to some kind of enormous animal. But they were unable to determine what kind of animal it was. At this point, although there was no real evidence connecting that strange print to Geraldine, people were starting to suspect that whoever or whatever left this print had something to do with her disappearance. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine had gone missing, some of the professional trackers made another discovery. They were 2.5 miles away from where that large print had been found in the swamp, and where Geraldine's own footprints had been found on the ledge. On the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake, they found a small piece of her plaid shirt snagged on a bush. And so they moved the entire search effort over to that section of Long Lake. And within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of her. From what remained, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. The initial thought was that she must have been attacked by wolves, and that's what killed her. But upon a closer inspection of her remains, they saw that her clothing had not been torn, and there was no blood on her clothes. This suggested that the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was already deceased. A wolf attack would have shredded the clothes, and there would be obvious marks indicating an attack. But here, it seemed the animals had picked around the clothing. Geraldine's remains also appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to the spot where she was ultimately located. So the investigators followed the drag line into this meadow. It led them to a clearing where all the grass had been matted down in a large oval shape. Investigators said it looked like something very big had been lying there. They speculated that this might have been the area where Geraldine had actually been killed, and that afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was eventually found. And so the investigators are thinking, we found that huge unidentified footprint in the swamp on the 7th day, in the same general area where we had found Geraldine's own footprint. We thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large impression, what appears to be a body print from something huge in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so it seems probable that whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this impression here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left the investigators with two theories, and neither of them really made any sense. The first one was that these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belonged to an enormous person, a giant of a man, who ran up to the cabin in broad daylight, silently abducted Geraldine, and ran off into the woods without anyone seeing or hearing them. And then, for weeks, this giant person managed to totally evade capture, despite, again, being an enormous person lumbering through the forest. That just seemed really unlikely. One, the place giant person even existed, and two, that if they did exist, how could they not get caught? They would be so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory. This makes a little more sense on the surface, because there are enormous predators in the wild that have on rare occasions attacked humans. So that does happen. But when the experts looked at her remains, they had already ruled out a wolf attack. And really, they had ruled out all known animal attacks based on the state of her clothing. So if this was some enormous, unknown predator, how did it kill Geraldine without leaving a trace on her clothes? The family was told that, unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they were unable to determine an official cause of death. Their best guess, they told the family, was that she was probably mauled by wild animals. But privately, they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this. You know, people love to say the woods are peaceful. Quiet. Safe. But the terrifying thing about all three of these stories is that nothing sounded wrong before those people vanished. No screams. No struggle. No warning. Just a child sitting 10 feet away, a son waiting beside a tree, a little girl playing outside her family's cabin, and then suddenly, nothing. As if the forest itself reached out and erased them. And maybe that's what makes cases like these so unsettling. Not the idea that something is out there in the woods, but the possibility that it can stand right beside you, silently watching, and you'd never know it was there until it decides to take you. Thank you so much for watching. For nearly 10 years, a brutal murder sat unsolved, not because there were no suspects, not because there were no clues, but because the most important piece of evidence was misunderstood. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't lost. It was right there in plain sight. And when investigators finally realized what it meant, it didn't just point to a killer, it exposed something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. But it would take nearly a decade and the help of a secretive group of elite crime solvers to finally see it for what it really was. If you're drawn to stories that are strange, dark, and deeply unsettling, then you're in the right place. Let's get into it. When classes began at Drexel University in Philadelphia on the cold morning of the 30th of November 1984, the campus was buzzing with its usual energy. Students were rushing to get to their classrooms, shivering in the chilly autumn air. But as some of those students were walking into Randall Hall, they made a gruesome discovery that would change the university forever. Crumpled at the bottom of an outdoor stairwell, hidden underneath a heavy gray jacket, was the body of a young woman. Her face was covered in deep cuts and severe bruising, showing that she had been brutally beaten. Around her neck, there was a deep, dark purple line where she had been strangled to death. She had no purse, no backpack, and absolutely nothing on her person to identify who she was. She was fully clothed, and there was no immediate evidence of sexual assault, but there was one very bizarre detail that stood out. She was completely missing her shoes and her socks. Her bare feet were exposed to the freezing air. The police were called to the scene immediately. They cordoned off the entire outdoor stairwell with yellow tape and began their investigation. Their very first suspicion was that this was a simple robbery that had turned deadly. But right away, the police knew they were in for a very difficult investigation. The first major hurdle was that there were absolutely no security cameras inside or outside of Randall Hall. This meant they could not just review footage to see who had been walking around the building. The second major hurdle was that Drexel University was not an isolated, closed-off campus. Its buildings were completely integrated into the urban streets of West Philadelphia. Randall Hall itself was located right along a known cut-through path that local residents used almost every single day to walk through the neighborhood. This meant there was a virtually unlimited number of potential suspects. To make matters worse, as the investigators analyzed the scene, it became very clear that this young woman had not been killed in this stairwell. She had been killed somewhere else and then dragged a great distance to this spot. The dragging process was likely how she lost her shoes and socks. The killer had then dumped her body at the bottom of the stairs and covered her with her own gray jacket. But just a couple of hours after the body was discovered, the police received a very lucky break. A young man who was incredibly combative and frantic rushed toward the closed-off crime scene. He was trying to push his way past the officers and demanded that they let him through because he said he knew the identity of the dead girl. The police were immediately suspicious of this. They had not released any details to the public, and they had not even identified the victim themselves. They pulled the young man aside and began interviewing him. He told the police his name was Kurt Rayner, and he was a student at Drexel. He said he believed the dead girl was his girlfriend, 20-year-old Debbie Wilson, who was also a student. He then proceeded to give the police a very long and highly complicated explanation of how he had figured out the identity of the victim. Kurt said that the night before, he had been with Debbie in the computer lab located in the basement of Randall Hall. He explained that Debbie had a massive project due the next day, and he had offered to keep her company while she worked on it. But by about 1:30 inches the morning, Debbie still had a lot of work left to do. Kurt said he was just incredibly tired and did not think he could stay awake any longer. So he asked Debbie if it would be okay if he went back to his dorm early. Debbie told him it was totally fine. She was used to working late in the computer lab and felt perfectly safe. Kurt said that even though he wanted to stick around and walk her safely to her car when she was done, he felt like she would be okay, so he took off on his own. On his walk back to the dorm, Kurt said he passed by a campus security guard. He actually stopped and asked the guard if he would mind checking on his girlfriend in the basement computer lab because she was all alone and it was very late. The security guard told him it was no problem and that he would make sure she was okay. The next morning, when Kurt woke up, he heard rumors from other students about a young woman's body being found outside Randall Hall and that it looked like a murder. Kurt said he did not think much of it at first. But later that day, when he went to campus to meet up with Debbie, he saw her car still parked in the computer lab parking lot, looking like it had never moved. And then, when he arrived at their designated meeting spot, Debbie never showed up. He said it was at that exact point that he realized the dead woman in Randall Hall had to be Debbie. And he was not wrong. It was indeed Debbie. But the police were absolutely not buying his story. He was the last person known to have seen Debbie alive. And by his own admission, he had heard that morning about a dead woman being found at the very place he had left his girlfriend all alone, yet he waited hours before bringing this up to anyone. The police also noticed something highly alarming on his hands. Kurt had fresh bruises on his knuckles and a deep cut between his fingers. Suddenly, Kurt seemed like the primary suspect. The nature of the crime suggested a deeply personal motive. Strangulation is a highly intimate act. The killer is almost always face-to-face with their victim, and it requires a massive amount of physical strength and rage to complete. Afterward, the killer had covered Debbie's body with her own jacket, which is an act that investigators know indicates remorse, guilt, or respect for the victim. Generally, when a young woman is murdered, her romantic partner is the very first suspect. But instead of tipping Kurt off that they were focusing on him, the detectives told him to go back to his dorm room and that they would be in touch with him as the investigation developed. In the meantime, the investigators turned their attention to the computer lab in the basement of Randall Hall. They found the computer that Debbie had been using. She had logged in to start her project, but had never logged out. Her computer cursor was left blinking mid-sentence. The timestamp of her last activity was exactly 1:38 a.m., just 8 minutes after Kurt said he left her. This led investigators to believe she was interrupted by her attacker inside the lab. As they swept the room, they found 2 extension cords on the floor near her computer that perfectly matched the ligature marks on Debbie's neck. They also found a small spot of blood on the back of Debbie's chair, which they carefully collected and sent off for testing. But as the police looked around the lab, they realized they had suffered a massive setback. The computer lab and the hallway right outside looked incredibly neat and clean. It turned out that the university janitor had cleaned the entire area earlier that morning, likely destroying critical physical evidence without realizing a crime had been committed. The police interviewed the janitor, who had a rock-solid alibi, and was devastated to learn she had cleaned a crime scene. When asked if she noticed anything strange, she said everything seemed normal, but she did recall that the tables and chairs inside the lab had been moved and pushed around. She had not thought much of it because students often moved the furniture while studying. Because the police lacked any physical evidence, they could not arrest Kurt. Instead, they asked him to come down to the station for a formal interview. During the questioning, Kurt vehemently insisted he had nothing to do with Debbie's death. As for the bruises and the cut on his hand, he claimed he had punched a concrete wall in a fit of grief after finding out what had happened to Debbie. He said the cut between his fingers was from working on his car a few days earlier. Since neither of those statements could be disproven, and they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, the police had to let him go. They then began digging deeper into his alibi. Kurt had told them that he passed a security guard on his walk back to his dorm and asked him to check on Debbie. The police tracked down that security guard, whose name was Bryce Clapman. Clapman was a longtime employee of Drexel with a stellar work record and no criminal history. Clapman completely confirmed Kurt's story. He said he spoke with Kurt around 1:30 inches the morning. After their conversation, Clapman used his radio to contact Bronson Ziegler, who was one of the two security guards working inside Randall Hall that night. Clapman told Ziegler that he or the other guard on duty, David Dixon, needed to go down to the basement and check on the girl. Clapman also mentioned that shortly after making that call, he saw a figure, presumably a student, walking outside Randall Hall. He said it was too dark and he was too far away to see any features, but he definitely saw someone walking around the premises around 1:30 a.m. Clapman stated he never went inside Randall Hall that night and volunteered to take a lie detector test. The police then ran background checks on the two guards who were inside Randall Hall, Bronson Ziegler and David Dixon. Dixon was a military veteran with a pristine record who was still active in the Army Reserves. Ziegler, however, had a much darker past. It turned out he had spent time in jail for burglary and had actually lied about his criminal record to get his job as a security guard. When police interviewed Ziegler, he was incredibly evasive, defensive, and frustrated. He admitted he received the message from Clapman to check on the girl, but said he did not feel like doing it himself. So, he claimed he radioed Dixon and told him to go do it instead. Ziegler insisted he had performed his security rounds properly. He told detectives they could check his security clock. This clock was a device that guards carried with them, which required them to insert keys located at designated stations along their route, stamping a physical card with the exact time of their arrival. When the police checked Ziegler's punch card, it showed he had hit all his stations at the correct times. But the detectives knew this did not clear him, as there was plenty of time in between his rounds to commit the crime. Toward the end of his interview, Ziegler became angry and sarcastically told detectives that yes, he killed Debbie, and then flatly refused to take a lie detector test. When the police interviewed David Dixon, he gave a completely different account. He said Ziegler had never radioed him and had never asked him to check on the girl in the computer lab. However, Dixon did say he was aware someone was working late. He explained that around 2:15 inches the morning, he walked past the basement lab, saw the lights on, and heard the loud sound of printers working inside. Not wanting to disturb whoever was in there, he did not look inside. He said he spent the next couple of hours talking on the phone with his girlfriend. Then, around 4:0 inches the morning, he went back to the lab. The lights were off and the door was locked, so he assumed they had finished and left and that Ziegler had locked up. When asked why neither he nor Ziegler had discovered Debbie's body, Dixon explained that their security rounds did not extend outside the building, so they never would have seen her in the outdoor stairwell. At this point, Bryce Clapman and David Dixon were ruled out as suspects, but Bronson Ziegler became their primary focus. However, just like with the boyfriend Kurt, there was no physical evidence tying Ziegler to the crime, so they could not arrest him. The investigators decided to try and identify the mysterious person Clapman had seen walking around Randall Hall at 1:30 a.m. After conducting interviews, they discovered it was a 28-year-old PhD student named Ashlyn Berhard. Berhard was known for keeping very long hours in his office, which happened to be located directly above the outdoor stairwell where Debbie was found. But he was also known for some highly disturbing behavior. Several female secretaries in his department reported that Berhard had a habit of creeping up behind them and suddenly holding a sharp pencil to their necks, threatening to kill them. When interviewed, Berhard admitted he was in Randall Hall that night, but claimed he did not know Debbie and had not left his office all night. He agreed to take a lie detector test, but failed it. When confronted, he scrambled for an explanation and named two other graduate students who could provide an alibi. But when police spoke to those students, they said Berhard had left the office around 1:00 the morning and was gone for about 3 hours. Berhard then claimed he had simply forgotten to mention that he left to take a nap in one of the study rooms, and that it was just a coincidence his nap coincided with the murder. The detectives did not believe him, but once again they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The police continued to look for other suspects. They began speaking to Debbie's friends, and that is when they learned that Debbie had a stalker. It was another student named Alan Smith. Alan had been a close friend of Debbie's, but when he tried to make the relationship romantic, Debbie rejected him. Alan did not take it well. He began following Debbie around campus, trying to force her to talk to him. Just the day before Debbie was killed, friends had witnessed a massive fight between them in the middle of campus, where Alan had grabbed Debbie's shoulder, shook her, and screamed in her face. The police tracked Alan down, but he had no alibi, claiming he was alone in his apartment. Like all the other suspects, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Around this time, the lab results from the small spot of blood found on the back of Debbie's chair finally came back. Since DNA profiling did not exist in 1984, the lab could only determine the blood type. The test showed the blood was type A. Debbie's blood was type O, meaning this drop of blood almost certainly belonged to her killer, who must have been cut during the struggle. The police immediately obtained blood samples from Kurt Rayner, Bronson Ziegler, Ashlyn Berhard, and Alan Smith. They were confident that one of them would be type A. But when the results came back, not a single one of them had type A blood. It was a crushing blow to the entire investigation. With no suspects left, the case began to stall. A wave of panic swept through the Drexel University campus. Students were outraged by the lack of security and demanded that guards be allowed to carry weapons. The university offered a $10,000 reward, and the president advised everyone to use the buddy system, stating he believed the killer was likely someone from their own community. No one could understand why anyone would target Debbie. She was a wonderfully kind young woman who worked incredibly hard. She had modeled in high school, but was not vain, even turning down braces because she was worried it would ruin her clarinet playing. She kept a picture of a Mercedes-Benz above her desk to keep herself motivated. That picture was still hanging there after she was gone. Her hard work had put her in danger that night, as she was determined to stay as late as necessary to finish her project. The physical evidence they did have did not seem to make sense. It did not appear to be a simple robbery. While she was missing her shoes and socks, she was still wearing an expensive watch. About a week after the murder, her backpack mysteriously turned up in the campus lost and found. No one knew who put it there, but all of her belongings were still intact inside. The police chased down every lead, but eventually the case went completely cold. In 1985, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story about the unsolved cases that haunted detectives the most, and Debbie's was at the top of the list. The lead investigators admitted they believed it was a random attack and feared the killer would strike again. Fast forward to the spring of 1992. Debbie's murder had been languishing in a cold case file for 8 years. The case was finally assigned to a new cold case squad led by Detective Bob Snyder. Desperate for a breakthrough, Snyder decided to throw a Hail Mary. He took the entire case file to the Vidocq Society. This was a private, highly exclusive club of elite criminology experts who met once a month in Philadelphia to review unsolved cases. The members included top homicide detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, forensic scientists, and even an aeronautic physicist. During one of their closed-door meetings, Detective Snyder stood before the society and presented every detail of Debbie Wilson's murder. For several hours, the members of the society debated the details, but could not find a way forward. Then, a man named Richard Walter stood up. Walter was a founding member of the society and a world-renowned criminal psychologist who had spent his career profiling dangerous killers. Walter looked at the crime scene details and told the detectives that they had missed the most important clue in the entire case: Debbie's missing shoes and socks. The original investigators had assumed they had simply fallen off while her body was being dragged. But Walter argued that while shoes might fall off, socks almost never slide off completely during dragging. He proposed that the killer had deliberately taken her white Reebok sneakers and her socks as trophies. Walter believed the killer was a power-assertive, macho type of personality who possessed a severe pathological foot fetish. Detective Snyder was intrigued by this profile and decided to bring the theory back to his team. They began reopening the case and re-interviewing everyone involved. When they spoke to the former manager of the computer lab at Randall Hall, he mentioned a small detail that had always bothered him. He told the detectives that the high-speed printers in the basement lab were connected to a central university system that was programmed to automatically shut down at exactly 10 p.m. every single night. Therefore, there was absolutely no way anyone could have heard printers running in that lab in the middle of the night. When Detective Snyder heard this, he was stunned. He immediately remembered the statement of David Dixon, the pristine military veteran who had been ruled out as a suspect. Dixon had claimed that at 2:15 inches the morning, he had walked past the computer lab and decided not to check inside because he heard the loud sound of the printers running. If the printers shut off at 10 p.m., Dixon was lying. The detectives immediately began looking much more closely at David Dixon. They requested his complete military record from the Army, and when they looked at the very back of his file, they found a disciplinary report from 1979. The report stated that during his first year of service, Dixon had been arrested for breaking into another soldier's barracks locker. The only item he had stolen was a pair of dirty, used white Reebok sneakers. This was the exact type of shoe that Debbie was known to wear. The police then began tracking down Dixon's former and current neighbors. They interviewed several women who had lived next to him over the years. At least 4 of these women reported that their apartments had been broken into while they were away. But what was bizarre was that the intruder had ignored their cash, jewelry, and electronics. The only things that were ever stolen were their used white athletic shoes and their dirty socks. None of the women had ever been able to find out who was responsible, but they all lived right next door to David Dixon. Armed with this evidence, Detective Snyder obtained a search warrant for Dixon's apartment. When officers conducted the search, they opened his closet and found a disturbing collection. Tucked away in the back were 20 pairs of used women's white athletic shoes, each pair meticulously wrapped in individual plastic bags to preserve them as trophies. They also uncovered 77 homemade video cassettes. When they played the tapes, they found hours of footage that Dixon had secretly recorded of women's feet as they walked around the campus and the city, always focusing on their white shoes. The detectives then went to interview Dixon's ex-wife, who had been his girlfriend on the night of the murder. Dixon had claimed his alibi was that he had spent hours on the phone chatting with her, but when the detectives spoke to her, she completely shattered his story. She told them that they had only spoken for a couple of minutes that night, not hours. Dixon had lied to the police to cover up his whereabouts during the exact hours that Debbie was killed. In June of 1993, the police officially arrested David Dixon and charged him with the first-degree murder of Debbie Wilson. While he refused to speak to the detectives and maintained his innocence, he could not keep his mouth shut once he was placed in a jail cell. Dixon began bragging to his cellmate about the crime. He told him in graphic detail how he had snuck into the computer lab, confronted Debbie, and killed her because he wanted to have his way with her feet and take her shoes as a prize. The cellmate, completely disgusted, immediately reported the confession to the guards. At the trial, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the stolen shoes, the videotapes, the broken alibi, and the cellmate's testimony. David Dixon was found guilty of the murder of Debbie Wilson and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The tragedy of Debbie's death left a deep, permanent scar on her family and the Drexel community. For nearly 10 years, her loved ones had to live with the agonizing pain of not knowing who had taken her away or why. Her dreams of graduating, playing her clarinet, and one day driving that Mercedes-Benz were stolen from her in an instant, all because of a predator's bizarre and deadly obsession. But because of the dedication of a relentless detective and the brilliant minds of the Vidocq Society, justice was finally served and a dangerous killer was taken off the streets forever. In this case, the truth was never hidden. It was simply overlooked. So, the next time something doesn't make sense, it might be worth asking, what small detail are we missing? Let me know what you think in the comments. On the morning of Sunday, the 17th of June, 2018, a 35-year-old man named Tristan Baudet woke up early. The first thing he did was grab his phone to check the weather forecast for Orange County, California. Orange County is a sprawling, beautiful suburb nestled between the massive cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. It was here that Tristan, his 36-year-old wife, Erica Wu, and their two little girls, who were just 2 and 4 years old, had built their life. And on this particular morning, which just so happened to be Father's Day, Tristan was hoping for good news. He had a plan. He wanted to take his whole family out for a perfect day at the beach to celebrate. He watched as the weather app loaded on his phone and a smile spread across his face. The forecast was for clear skies and sunshine all day. But honestly, even if the app had predicted rain and cold, Tristan probably would have tried to convince everyone to go to the beach anyway. For Tristan, being outdoors was his happy place. It didn't matter if it was hiking in the mountains, camping under the stars, or just tossing a frisbee in a park. If he was outside, he was content. This love for nature was something he had already passed down to his 2 young daughters. They were his little adventure sidekicks, always eager to explore the world with their dad. It made Tristan incredibly happy to see them falling in love with the same things he did. His wife Erica, she enjoyed the outdoors too, but maybe not with the same level of passion as Tristan. But that was perfectly fine with him. Tristan was the kind of person who just went with the flow. He would make small adjustments to make sure she was comfortable. For instance, whenever they went camping, he was happy to rough it in a tent on the hard ground. But he would always pack a big, full-sized inflatable mattress just for Erica. And it wasn't just about the mattress. It was about his entire personality. Erica adored him for it. He was just so easygoing and accepting of people as they were. He never judged anyone. He was just at peace with the world. In fact, that exact quality was what first drew Erica to him all those years ago. They had met back in high school. Some mutual friends had set them up because Tristan needed a date for a school dance. Erica agreed to go with him, and the night of the dance was the first time she ever laid eyes on him. And he was quite a sight. Over the summer, he had shot up a few inches in height, but hadn't quite filled out yet, so he was tall and very lanky. And for this dance, he was completely overdressed in a full tuxedo, but he wasn't self-conscious about it at all. He was just genuinely excited to be there with a date. And all night long, Tristan owned that tuxedo, dancing with all his lanky, gangly glory as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He made it his mission to make sure Erica had a great time, and she absolutely did. After that night, the two of them were pretty much inseparable. Their lives took them on impressive paths. Erica went on to study at Stanford University and became a successful OBGYN doctor. Tristan became a brilliant and widely published scientist. He even held a patent related to vaccine delivery. On paper, his resume was unbelievable, stacked with achievements, but all that success never changed the core of who Tristan was. His colleagues at the lab, who all loved him, found it hilarious. Here was this genius chemist working on cutting-edge cancer treatments, a guy doing incredibly complex research, who was also this laid-back person who walked around the lab starting most of his sentences with the word dude. By early afternoon on that Father's Day, the Bodette family had made their way to a local beach. Erica settled into a beach chair with a book, while Tristan and the two little girls set up a sunshade right at the edge of the water. They started digging in the sand, building little castles. Every so often, Erica would look up from her book and watch them. She'd see them laughing as they dug. Then they'd suddenly abandon their project and run into the shallow surf, shrieking with delight as they tried to outrun these small, gentle waves that crashed around their ankles. At one point, Erica looked up and saw her daughters having the time of their lives, and then she saw Tristan look over at her. He flashed her this huge, happy grin. And in that one single moment, watching her family, Erica felt a sense of pure contentment wash over her. It was a feeling that didn't always come easily to her. Unlike Tristan, who could just relax and enjoy life as it came, Erica was a constant worrier. This anxiety traced all the way back to when she was just 8 years old. That was the year she lost her father. It was a deeply traumatic event that had devastated her family and cast a long shadow over her childhood. Ever since then, she had lived with a persistent, quiet fear that no matter how good things were, something terrible was always just around the corner, waiting to ruin it all. But sitting there on the beach, seeing that smile on her husband's face, and hearing the laughter of her children, that fear melted away. It was a perfect moment. So Erica put her book down, got up from her chair, and ran to join her family in the water. She had no way of knowing that her deepest fear was about to become a reality. 4 days later, on Thursday, June 21st, the atmosphere at their home was very different. Erica was trying to study for a huge medical exam she was scheduled to take the very next day. But with Tristan and their two energetic daughters at home, the house was loud and chaotic. It was impossible for her to focus. Tristan could see the stress on her face. He also knew that on top of the exam, they were only a week away from a massive life change. They were moving to San Francisco. They had already put a deposit down on a new house up there, closer to some of their family. It was a good move for them, but it added another huge layer of pressure. Looking at his wife, Tristan knew she needed a break. She needed some peace and quiet to study and prepare. And so, he came up with a plan. He decided he would take the girls and get out of the house for the weekend. He made a couple of quick phone calls. A little while later, he went to Erica and told her what he had arranged. He had booked a campsite up in Malibu, California. Malibu is another one of those iconic Southern California towns about an hour-and-a-half drive north of Orange County. It's known for being a wealthy enclave where celebrities live, and he told her that he had also called his brother-in-law, Scott, who had 2 young sons of his own, ages 3 and 5. The plan was for all of them to go camping together for the weekend. Erica was incredibly grateful. She really did need the time and space to study. But at the same time, a familiar sense of worry started to creep in. Tristan often took the girls on little adventures, but he had never taken them camping overnight by himself without her there. Her first instinct was to object, to say it wasn't a good idea. But Tristan, who knew his wife so well, reassured her. He told her not to worry. He promised he would take great care of the kids. He explained that it was a very public, well-known campground with lots of other people around. He promised it was totally safe. Eventually, Erica was convinced. So Tristan started packing up the car. He loaded in all the camping gear, the kids' toys, and their little bikes. As he worked, the girls were buzzing with excitement about their big camping trip. But Erica couldn't shake a bad feeling. A part of her was silently hoping that something would happen and they would have to cancel the trip. She just felt like something bad was about to happen. But nothing happened to stop them. After the car was all packed and the girls were buckled into their car seats, Tristan came over to Erica. He gave her a kiss goodbye and told her he'd see her in a couple of days. He wished her good luck on her test. And with that, he got into the driver's seat, backed out of the driveway, and headed up the road towards Malibu. Erica stood and watched until the car disappeared from sight. That night, Erica studied late into the evening before finally going to bed. The next morning, she woke up early. She was feeling anxious about the test, and she was still worried about Tristan and the girls. As she was getting ready for her day, she heard a loud, insistent knock on her front door. She glanced at the clock. It was only 6:45 inches the morning. It made no sense. No one should be knocking on her door at this hour. Maybe it was Tristan, but if it were him, he would have just used his key. Apprehensively, she walked to the front of the house and opened the door. The moment she saw who was standing on her porch, she knew. She knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Erica would later look back on that moment opening the door. And even though it was irrational, she would sometimes think to herself, what if I had just never opened the door? Would this nightmare still have happened? But she did open the door, and standing there was her sister-in-law, Priscilla. Priscilla lived an hour and a half away and was completely unannounced. Her face was frantic and tear-streaked. And then Priscilla gave Erica the most heartbreaking news a person could ever receive. The words were so shocking, so world-shattering, that Erica's mind literally could not process them. She kept thinking, this can't be true. There has to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Erica would not be taking her medical exam that day. Instead, she got into the car with Priscilla, and they began the long, silent drive to Malibu. The day before, Tristan and his two little girls had arrived at the entrance to Malibu Creek State Park. When you think of Malibu, you probably picture mansions on the beach. But just inland from the coast, the landscape changes dramatically. It becomes rugged and wild, full of deep canyons and dense forests. And nestled right in the middle of all this wilderness is the state park. Tristan and his brother-in-law Scott pulled up to the gate, checked in with the park rangers, and were given directions to their campsites. They had reserved 2 spots right next to each other. A campsite in a place like this is usually just a simple, square plot of dirt, maybe with a fire pit. It's just enough space to pitch a tent. So Tristan and Scott drove across the campground to their assigned spots. But as soon as they got there, Tristan realized the spots weren't very good. They were located right next to the portable toilets, so there was a bit of a smell, and a lot of people were walking back and forth. The ground was also on a slight slope, which would make sleeping uncomfortable. It just wasn't ideal. Scott agreed, so he decided to go back and talk to the rangers to see if they could move. He drove back to the entrance, spoke with a ranger, and it turned out to be no problem at all. The ranger told him there were 2 other open sites on the far side of the park, and they could just swap their reservation. So Tristan and Scott packed everything back up and drove over to the new spots. And these ones were perfect. They were tucked away at the base of a huge sloping canyon wall, far from any bathrooms or foot traffic. It felt private and secluded, and the ground was perfectly flat. The 2 men were thrilled. They started unloading their cars and setting up their tents, while the 4 kids ran around playing and riding their small bikes. Once the tents were up, they built a fire in the fire pit, which was situated right between the 2 campsites. Scott would be sleeping in his tent with his 2 sons, and Tristan would be in his tent with his 2 daughters. As the sun went down, they all gathered around the fire. They roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, that classic camping treat of marshmallows, chocolate, so graham crackers. The dads told funny jokes and some not too spooky stories. Before long, all 4 kids were completely exhausted. So Scott and Tristan each took their own children and tucked them into their sleeping bags inside the tents. After the kids were settled, the 2 men came back out to the fire. Tristan had brought some pre-made cocktails, and he shared one with Scott. They sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet of the night and each other's company. Tristan talked a lot about the upcoming move to San Francisco, and Scott was happy to just sit and listen. Eventually, they were both tired too. They decided it was time to call it a night. They carefully put out the fire. Scott gave Tristan a hug and told him he loved him. Then the two men went to their separate tents. As Scott climbed into his tent with his sleeping sons, he looked across the now dark fire pit towards Tristan's tent. He could just make out the silhouette of Tristan climbing inside with his girls. After seeing that, Scott zipped up his own tent, lay down, and within about 15 minutes, he was fast asleep. Just before sunrise the next morning, around 4:45 a.m., Scott suddenly woke up. He thought he had heard a loud noise, but he was groggy and couldn't quite place what it was. He lay there in the dark, listening. And as he got his bearings, he realized that one of Tristan's daughters was crying in the other tent. Now, this wasn't immediately alarming. Kids cry. He figured Tristan would comfort her in a minute and she would go back to sleep. But the crying didn't stop. It just continued. Scott knew that Tristan was a notoriously heavy sleeper, so he started to think, okay, maybe he just hasn't woken up yet. That must be why he's not calming his daughter down. So Scott carefully got out of his sleeping bag, trying not to wake his own sons. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The air was cold, and it was still dark. He couldn't see anything inside of Tristan's tent. He walked over to it, and by the time he got there, he could hear Tristan's daughter still crying, clear as day. Scott called out in a loud whisper, "Hey, Tristan. Tristan, wake up!" But there was no response. Nothing. With the little girl still crying just on the other side of the thin nylon wall, Scott decided he had to look inside. He walked around to the front of the tent, found the zipper, and pulled it open. He peered inside, but it was too dark to see clearly. But even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could make out the shapes. He could see Tristan lying still in the middle of the tent. On either side of him were his two daughters. It looked like the 2-year-old was the one who was crying, and the 4-year-old was awake too, whimpering and trying her best to comfort her little sister. As Scott was trying to figure out what was going on, the two little girls turned and looked up at him. When they saw him, they both started saying the same word over and over. Wet. 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 Scott had no idea what they meant. He was starting to feel a surge of panic. He knew something was very wrong. He reached into the tent and started shaking Tristan's shoulder, saying, "Hey, wake up," but the second he touched him, he knew. He knew instantly. Tristan wasn't sleeping. Tristan was dead. And his two little girls were sitting right next to him in a pool of his blood. Just before Scott had woken up, someone somewhere nearby in the darkness of the park had fired a gun. One of the bullets from that gun had traveled through the night, pierced the thin wall of Tristan's tent, and had struck him directly in the head as he slept peacefully between his two daughters. About 2 hours after that, Priscilla arrived on Erica's doorstep to tell her what had happened. To tell her that her husband was gone and that her two little girls were now going to grow up without a father, just like she did. The news didn't just break Erica's heart, it completely shattered her world. A 42-year-old man named Anthony Rauda was eventually arrested and charged with Tristan's murder. Rauda had a long and violent criminal history, and at the time of the shooting, he was living illegally off the grid deep in the canyons of that very same park. When police finally caught up to him, he was in possession of a rifle. And ballistics tests later confirmed that it was the same rifle that had fired the bullet that killed Tristan. His trial has been a long and difficult process. It's been repeatedly delayed because Rauda keeps firing his defense attorneys. Although he insists that he is innocent, his behavior in court has done nothing to help his case. He has been so violent and erratic during his court appearances that he has to be strapped into a special chair by his wrists and legs. They even have to put a device called a spit hood over his head to stop him from spitting at or biting people. Assuming that he was the shooter, which the evidence strongly suggests he was, the motive appears to be completely random. It's believed he didn't know Tristan at all. He just, for whatever reason, fired his gun that night. Maybe he was firing recklessly into the darkness, or maybe he intentionally aimed at the tent. We don't know for sure. But either way, one of his bullets found its target, and Tristan Baudet was killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if the story wasn't already tragic enough, one more detail emerged that made it even more distressing. Tristan's death was not the first shooting to happen in or around Malibu Creek State Park. In the year leading up to his murder, there had been an astounding 6 other shootings in the immediate area. And 2 of those shootings happened inside the very same campground where Tristan was killed. None of those other shootings had been fatal, but in all 6 cases, the person or people responsible were never caught. And it seemed the local police hadn't put much effort into investigating them. It wasn't until a father was killed in his tent next to his children that the stories of all these other unsolved shootings finally came to light. People started looking at a map and connecting the dots. They realized there was a pattern. There was a rogue shooter who had been active in that exact area for a year, and the public had never been warned. The campground was never closed. No one was told that there was a potential danger lurking in the wilderness there. And the big question everyone had was, why? We may get answers to those questions during Anthony Rauda's trial, where he's being charged not only with Tristan's murder, but for all those other shootings as well. In the meantime, Erica has filed a $90 million lawsuit against several government agencies. Her lawsuit argues that her husband had no idea about the threat that existed in that park. If the authorities had just put up a single sign, a single warning to the public, Tristan, being the protective father he was, would have never ever taken his children there. And he would still be alive today. That lawsuit is still ongoing. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Sometimes we think we have a solid grip on how the world works. We wake up, we go about our normal routines, and we assume that the rules of reality will keep everything in its proper place. We trust our senses, we trust our minds, and we trust that the environments we step into will behave in predictable ways. But every now and then, the universe decides to throw those rules completely out the window. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that demonstrate just how bizarre, unpredictable, and downright terrifying life can be when the ordinary suddenly collides with the impossible. These are stories about real people who found themselves in situations that sound like they were pulled straight from a Hollywood movie. But every single one of these events actually happened, and the details will leave you questioning how much we truly know about the world around us. From a chaotic clash of identities on the streets of Detroit, to a mysterious voice that acted as a guardian angel in London, and finally to a man who defied the laws of probability in the dark waters of the Atlantic, these stories show us that reality is often much stranger than fiction. Our first story takes us to the city of Detroit, Michigan, specifically to the east side of the city on Andover Street. If you were to ask anyone who lives in this neighborhood, they would tell you right away that Andover Street has a reputation. It is an area that has been heavily affected by drug activity for a very long time. Because of this, the local police department is constantly running operations to try and clean up the streets and keep the community safe. On a cold Thursday morning, specifically November 9th, 2017, 2 special operations officers from the Detroit Police Department were getting ready to start a specific type of undercover operation known as a push-off. Now, if you are not familiar with what a push-off is, it is basically a reverse sting operation. Undercover police officers will set themselves up in an area, usually in a house, that is known for drug transactions, and they will pretend to be the local drug dealers. When unsuspecting customers walk up to the house trying to buy drugs, the undercover officers will invite them inside, wait for them to make a verbal request to purchase illegal substances, and then immediately arrest them and seize their vehicles. These two particular special operations officers had been working deep undercover in this specific neighborhood for quite a while. Because they had been there so long, they had a very specific local drug house that they had secured and set up for this exact operation. They arrived at the house, got themselves in character, and began to wait. Meanwhile, not too far away, another unit from a completely different police precinct was planning their own drug enforcement operation for that very same day. This second unit consisted of a group of undercover officers who were running a buy-bust operation. A buy-bust is the exact opposite of a push-off. In a buy-bust, undercover officers pretend to be drug buyers. They walk around the neighborhood, look for active drug houses, and attempt to buy illegal substances from real drug dealers. Once the transaction is initiated, they signal their backup team to swoop in and make the arrest. But the problem was that there was a massive breakdown in communication between the two different police precincts. Neither group had any idea that the other group was operating on Andover Street that morning. It was a classic bureaucratic oversight, but on the streets, it was a recipe for disaster. Around midday, two undercover officers from the 2nd Precinct were walking down Andover Street looking for active drug houses. They saw the house where the first two undercover officers were waiting. To the officers from the 2nd Precinct, this house looked exactly like a real active drug house, and to the officers inside, the two men walking up to the porch looked exactly like typical drug customers. The two undercover buyers walked up the steps and knocked on the front door. The undercover officers inside opened the door, looked them over, and in accordance with their training, invited them inside. The buyers walked in and sat down in the living room. The undercover officers, acting as dealers, asked them what they were looking for. The buyers then asked if they could purchase some drugs. As soon as those words left their mouths, the undercover officers, acting as dealers, whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and ordered the two men to get on the ground. But instead of complying, the two buyers did something that absolutely shocked the dealers. They also whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and yelled back that no, they were the ones who needed to get on the ground. At this point, both groups of officers were standing in a freezing, high-tension standoff. Neither side believed the other side was actually telling the truth. In the high-stakes world of undercover operations, criminals will often pose as police officers to rob rival dealers or escape arrest. So, the officers from the 1st Precinct were convinced that these two buyers were actually armed criminals using fake police badges. And the officers from the 2nd Precinct were convinced that the dealers were criminals trying to rip them off with fake badges of their own. They stood there, guns pointed at each other, in a tense standoff that looked exactly like that famous scene from The Office, where everyone is pointing a gun at everyone else, trying to figure out who the double agent is. They began periodically hurling insults and threats at each other, trying to force the other side to stand down. But nobody was backing down. The tension in the room was boiling over, and both sides were terrified that if they fired a shot, it would end in a bloodbath. But instead of pulling their triggers, when neither side stood down, they all eventually lowered their weapons. But they did not talk it out. Instead, they lunged at each other and proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. A massive, chaotic fistfight broke out right there in the living room. Within moments, the backup officers from both precincts, who had been waiting nearby in unmarked vehicles, saw the commotion and rushed into the house. But instead of breaking up the fight, they also got confused and joined in. It turned into a massive brawl of police officers fighting other police officers, with punches flying, furniture breaking, and complete chaos taking over the house. After the dust finally settled and the haymakers had stopped, someone finally managed to get a radio transmission through, and the two groups of police suddenly realized the monumental mistake they had just made. They immediately stopped fighting and began to apologize to one another, nursing their bruises and panting for air. Luckily, none of the officers were critically injured in this bizarre mix-up. However, two officers did have to be taken to the hospital for treatment, though fortunately their injuries were very minor. One officer ended up with a massive black eye, and another had a split lip. When the news of this incident got out, Detroit's own chief of police, along with the media and the public at large, all came out and said that this entire snafu was a total embarrassment for the department. It showed a clear lack of coordination and communication. But, on the other hand, some people argued that the officers involved actually deserved a little bit of credit. After all, their job was to be undercover. And they were apparently so incredibly good at being undercover that they were able to completely fool other trained professional police officers who were looking for the exact same things. It turns out they were just too good at their jobs, but you can be the judge of that. Our next story was pulled from a 1997 article published in the prestigious British medical journal, The Show. This article was written by a psychiatrist who personally treated the patient, who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason we bring this up right at the beginning is because this story sounds so completely made up that if it were not documented in an official, peer-reviewed medical journal, it would be almost impossible to believe. One night in the cold winter of 1984, a healthy, middle-aged woman, who we will call Brenda for the sake of this story, was sitting in her quiet home in London, England. It was a completely normal, peaceful evening. Brenda was sitting on her couch, enjoying the quiet warmth of her living room and reading a book. But as she was reading, she suddenly heard a voice speak directly in her head. The voice did not sound like her own thoughts, and it did not sound like it was coming from the room around her. It was a distinct, clear, calm voice that spoke directly into her mind. The voice said, "Please do not be afraid." I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and I, we used to work at the Children's Hospital, and we would like to help you. Brenda sat frozen on her couch. She could not believe what was happening. She had absolutely no history of mental illness, she had never heard voices in her head before, and she was a completely rational, healthy person. The voice she was hearing was so incredibly clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had ever heard in her real life. At first, Brenda did not do anything. She just sat there on the couch holding her book, waiting and hoping that this was just some strange, fleeting trick of her mind. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her internal panic. The voice spoke again and said, "Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We are real and we want to help you." Brenda did not believe the voice was real. She was absolutely convinced that she had just lost her mind and was experiencing some kind of sudden, severe mental breakdown. For the rest of the night, she did her absolute best to completely ignore the voice in her head, trying to focus on anything else. First thing the next morning, Brenda went to her doctor's office, explained what was happening, and begged them for help. The doctor was very concerned and immediately referred her to a local psychiatrist. Brenda went over to the psychiatrist's office, and they performed a thorough psychological evaluation. After talking with her, the psychiatrist admitted that they did not really know why she was suddenly hearing these voices. There was absolutely no clear medical explanation or typical trigger for why a healthy, middle-aged woman with no history of mental issues would suddenly start hearing clear, distinct voices. So Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with a rare condition called functional hallucinatory psychosis. This diagnosis basically meant that Brenda was indeed hallucinating, but there was no clear physical or psychological reason why it was happening. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with a strong antipsychotic drug, and they also set up regular supportive counseling sessions. Over the next couple of weeks, Brenda was incredibly diligent. She took her medications exactly as prescribed, and she never missed a single appointment. And slowly but surely, the voices in her mind began to fade, and eventually they stopped completely. Brenda was overjoyed. She went back into her psychiatrist's office, looked at him, and said, "Doctor, you have saved me. The voices are completely gone, and I am so happy." The psychiatrist would later write in his medical journal that Brenda was visibly relieved during this appointment. It was completely obvious to him that she was not making any of this up. She had really believed she was hearing these voices, she had been terrified by them, and now she was profoundly grateful to have her life back to normal. After leaving the office, Brenda decided that she and her family needed to celebrate. They decided to go on a vacation outside of London just to relax and enjoy the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while they were away on holiday enjoying the peaceful countryside, the nightmare returned. Brenda suddenly heard the voices in her head again. But this time, the tone was different. It was urgent. The voices told her that she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. Along with this warning, the voices did something even more bizarre. They gave her a very specific street address in London that she was supposed to go to in order to seek immediate treatment. Brenda was absolutely horrified. She was devastated that the voices were back after she thought she was cured, but she was also incredibly scared by the specific nature of what they were saying. She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some terrifying truth to what these voices were telling her. What if there really was something horribly wrong with her body? Brenda ran to her husband crying and explained everything that had just happened. Her husband was a very loving and reassuring man. He held her and told her that she should just try to totally ignore the voices again. He pointed out that they had gone away before with medication, and there was probably nothing physically wrong with her. He urged her to just try to relax and enjoy the rest of their vacation. But Brenda could not relax. No matter what her husband said, she could not ignore the voices because they were constantly speaking to her now, repeating the same urgent message over and over again. They kept saying, "You need to leave, you need to go back, there is something wrong with you." Finally, unable to bear the constant mental pressure, Brenda convinced her family to end their vacation early, pack up their things, and head back to London. As soon as they arrived in the city, Brenda made her husband get in the car with her, and they drove straight to the exact street address the voices had given her. When they arrived and stepped out of the car, they found themselves standing right in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband stood on the pavement, completely shocked. They had never been to this building before, and Brenda had no prior knowledge of this specific medical facility or its address. But before they could even begin to process the sheer impossibility of what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back with absolute clarity. They told her that she needed to go inside the building immediately and request a brain scan for two very specific reasons. First, they said there was a tumor in her brain. Second, they said this tumor was causing her brain stem to swell. At first, Brenda went inside the brain scan facility and requested an immediate scan, honestly admitting to the reception staff that voices in her head had directed her to this exact address. Because she had no official doctor referral, the hospital had to turn her away, leaving Brenda in a state of absolute panic. She immediately called her psychiatrist, explaining how the voices had guided her to this real medical building. The psychiatrist was highly skeptical, but agreed to order the scan anyway, solely to put her mind at ease. A month later, Brenda had the scan done, and the results completely shocked the entire medical community. The scan revealed she indeed had a brain tumor, and her brain stem was swollen, despite her showing absolutely no physical symptoms. After consulting her family, Brenda chose immediate surgery. As soon as she made the decision, the voices told her she had made the right choice. The surgery was a total success. In the recovery room, the voices spoke to her one last time, saying they were pleased to have helped her and said goodbye. Brenda never heard them again. To this day, the medical community still has no explanation for who or what those voices in Brenda's head really were. Our final story is about a man named Michael Packard, who might be either the luckiest or unluckiest person alive, depending on how you look at his incredible life. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he survived a horrific plane crash over the jungles of Costa Rica that tragically killed the pilot, co-pilot, and another passenger on impact. Michael and 4 other survivors were left badly injured and stranded in the extremely remote wilderness for 48 agonizing hours before search and rescue teams finally reached them. Doctors later told him he would not have survived another night in the jungle. Over the next 2 decades, Michael, a commercial diver by trade, survived 2 separate great white shark encounters off California, got lost at sea for hours in the open ocean before being miraculously rescued, and even discovered a long-time missing person's body 60 feet underwater off the coast of Massachusetts. But absolutely none of these events compare to what happened to him on the morning of June 11th, 2021, when he experienced a 1 in a trillion event that baffled scientists around the world. On that peaceful summer morning, the 57-year-old Michael climbed into his boat with his longtime diving partner Josiah, heading out off the coast of Cape Cod to do some lobster diving. Around 8 in the morning, after successfully gathering about 100 pounds of lobsters, Michael decided to go down for one final dive. Josiah watched from the boat as Michael disappeared below the surface of the calm water. Suddenly, Josiah saw a massive, violent eruption of white water where Michael had just submerged, followed by a dark shadow moving rapidly below. Michael had been descending to 60 feet when, at about 45 feet, something hit him from behind like a freight train, immediately plunging him into total darkness and knocking his mouthpiece out. Fumbling around in panic, Michael felt soft, warm, quivering, muscular walls that were actively pulsating. He managed to find his regulator, took a deep breath, and realized there were no sharp teeth, meaning he was not inside a shark. He had actually been scooped up by a giant humpback whale. Humpback whales only eat very small fish, and when this whale realized it had accidentally swallowed a human and a heavy metal scuba tank, it began violently shaking its head side to side to eject him. This thrashing was what caused the dramatic eruption of water Josiah saw from the boat. After 45 agonizing seconds inside the whale's mouth, Michael was finally spat back out into the open water. He swam directly to the surface, saw the whale's tail fins swimming away, and was pulled to safety by Josiah. Miraculously, Michael suffered only minor bruising on his legs and was released from the hospital that very same afternoon. He remained incredibly casual about the encounter, telling reporters he could not wait to heal up and get back to lobster diving. These 3 stories, as different as they are, remind us of a powerful truth. We live our lives under the illusion of control, believing our minds, our identities, and our natural world are completely predictable. But whether it is undercover police officers clashing on a Detroit street, a mysterious voice pointing to a silent brain tumor in London, or a commercial diver being swallowed by a gentle giant of the deep off Cape Cod, we are always just one moment away from the completely unbelievable. These events show us that the division between reality and fiction is incredibly thin, and sometimes the strangest mysteries are the ones that actually happen. They leave us with a lingering sense of wonder and a reminder that no matter how much we plan, the universe will always find a way to surprise us. So perhaps the real question is not whether these stories are true or not, but how many similar stories exist that we will never hear about. Because the truth is, moments like these come without warning. They don't follow the rules. And when they happen, they change everything. If you've made it this far, you already know reality is unfair. See you in the next story. On a sunny afternoon in June of 2005, a 57-year-old truck driver named Jack Reed took a sip of his margarita at a barbecue in a park in Derry, New Hampshire. Jack didn't usually drink, but this was a special occasion. He was celebrating his daughter Megan's high school graduation, and for Jack, this was a massive deal. He had grown up in the foster care system with absolutely nothing. Every dollar he earned, every long day behind the wheel of a truck, had been for one reason: to make sure his children had a better life than he did. So seeing Megan graduate, seeing her make good choices and finish school, filled him with an immense sense of pride. At that moment, sitting in the warm summer sun surrounded by his family, Jack felt like all of his years of hard work had finally meant something. What he didn't know was that within a few weeks, he would vanish without a trace. He looked over at one of the picnic tables. Megan was sitting there, laughing with her brother, Jack Jr. Their mother, Virginia, was there too. Even though Jack and Virginia weren't together anymore, they had remained on good terms. He was genuinely glad that the whole family could be there to celebrate Megan's big day. But then, Jack's good mood shifted slightly. He tensed up as he saw someone walking across the grass toward their table. It was Megan's boyfriend, Walter. Megan and Walter had recently moved in together, and Jack was not thrilled about it at all. It wasn't that he had a specific problem with Walter as a person, but his daughter was only 18 years old. In Jack's mind, she was far too young to be living with a boyfriend. But Jack knew this wasn't the time to start an argument. He didn't want to ruin the celebration. So instead, he stood up, walked over to Walter, and pulled him into a friendly hug. Then the two of them sat down with the rest of the family, and for a little while, everything seemed perfectly normal. Until Jack disappeared. That evening, after the party had wound down, Jack drove his car home. He made a stop at a gas station along the way. He parked at the pump, went inside, and passed the cashier a few bills. He needed a tank of gas, and while he was there, he bought a lottery ticket. Jack was a regular lottery player. He'd never won anything significant, but he always held on to the hope that one day his luck would change. He dreamed of hitting the jackpot and striking it rich. He put the ticket into his pocket, went back outside, and filled up his car. From there, he drove the last few blocks to his home. It was a trailer parked behind a large warehouse on the edge of town. One of the main reasons Jack chose to live there was the space. There was plenty of room to park all of his work vehicles, which was essential for his business. This included his large, distinctive red and black dump truck. After years of working for other people as a truck driver, Jack had managed to build his own trucking business from the ground up. He did all sorts of jobs, from garbage removal to moving services and other odd jobs that required a big truck. He was making a decent living, but he was still very frugal. He lived in his rented trailer so he could save as much money as possible for his retirement. His ultimate goal was to save up enough so that in a couple of years, once Jack Jr. was done with school, he could finally leave the cold, harsh New Hampshire winters behind. He dreamed of moving to sunny, beautiful Las Vegas. He'd gotten the idea a couple of years earlier when he'd done a moving job for a local self-made millionaire. The man was moving from New Hampshire to Las Vegas, and Jack had been so impressed by his success. He saw the millionaire as a symbol of what was possible, and he truly believed that if he just worked hard enough, or maybe got lucky enough with one of his lottery tickets, he could follow that same path to wealth and a comfortable retirement. Jack got out of his car and walked over to his trailer. He opened the door, stepped inside, and flipped on the lights. He was just about to sit down and take off his shoes when he heard a noise outside. His body went rigid. He immediately went to the window, pulled back the curtains, and peered out into the dark woods behind the property. He scanned the tree line, but he couldn't see anything. Still, his heart was racing. He had to take a few deep breaths to calm himself down. Almost 2 years before, there had been an incident. Jack had heard someone creeping around outside his trailer late at night. He'd grabbed his gun and gone out to confront them. He saw a man standing at the edge of the woods, just staring. The man had looked right at him and had even called out his name, which was the most unsettling part. Panicked, Jack had actually fired his gun at the man, who then turned and ran away into the woods. He never came back, and Jack never found out who he was or what he wanted. As far as Jack knew, he didn't have any enemies. The encounter made no sense at all. But because the strange man was never caught, Jack remained on edge. Any strange noise he heard outside his trailer at night brought that memory rushing back. Now, as he looked out the window and felt sure that there was nobody there, Jack let the curtains fall back into place. He took the lottery ticket out of his pocket, sat down at his small table, and started scratching off the silver foil with a coin. One by one, the numbers were revealed. He wasn't a winner this time. But it didn't dampen his mood. He tossed the ticket in the trash. There was always next time. He knew, or at least he hoped, that his lucky break was just around the corner. A couple of weeks later, on the morning of Monday, June 27th, Jack climbed up into the cab of his dump truck and rolled down the windows. It was already getting hot outside, and he was on his way to the only job he had lined up for the day. It was a simple trash disposal gig that would probably only take a few hours. He started the truck, and just as he was pulling out onto the road, his cell phone rang. He answered it. A man's voice on the other end said his name was Charlie. Charlie said he'd heard that Jack hauled stuff away and that he had a new barn that really needed to be cleaned out. He asked if Jack could do it. Jack said, sure. He told Charlie he could actually do it that very afternoon. He grabbed his logbook from the passenger seat, flipped to a blank page, and scribbled down the details. He wrote down the name Charlie and an address in Deerfield, which was almost 30 miles away. Jack told Charlie he would call him as soon as he was on his way, and then the two men hung up. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Jack was driving his dump truck down a very secluded 2-lane road in Deerfield. It was sweltering outside. The air was thick and humid. He was already exhausted and dripping with sweat from the trash disposal job he'd done that morning. He had no idea what to expect from this barn cleaning job with this guy Charlie, but he was hoping it wouldn't take too long. Jack slowed the truck as the trees to his right parted, revealing a gravel driveway. He turned onto the driveway, and a few seconds later, he pulled up in front of a white 2-story house with a big barn out back. Jack parked his dump truck, got out, and walked up to the front door. He rang the doorbell, and a moment later, the door opened. 2 days later, on the afternoon of June 29th, Jack's daughter Megan and her boyfriend Walter walked up to the front door of Jack's trailer. The first thing Megan noticed was that her dad's big red and black dump truck was not parked in its usual spot. That seemed wrong. An immediate knot formed in her stomach. About an hour earlier, Megan had gotten a call from her mother, Virginia. She said that Jack hadn't shown up for a job that morning and, more concerning, he wasn't answering his phone. This was completely out of character for him. So Megan had told her mom that she and Walter would go over to his trailer and make sure everything was okay. Initially, Megan had just assumed her dad had overslept or maybe even forgotten about the job. But now, seeing that the dump truck was gone, it looked like he had actually left for work. But if he'd left for work, why hadn't he shown up? And why wasn't he answering his phone? Nonetheless, Megan knocked on the trailer door just to be absolutely sure her dad wasn't home. There was no answer. At this point, Megan's worry started to escalate. She called her mom back to tell her that Jack wasn't there and that his truck was gone. She admitted to her mom that she was starting to get really worried. A few minutes later, Virginia pulled up in her car. Megan, Walter, and Virginia stayed there right outside the trailer for the rest of the afternoon. They kept hoping that maybe Jack would just show up at some point, that there was a simple explanation for all of this. They called his phone over and over and over again, but every single time it went straight to voicemail. Finally, around 6:30 in the evening, when they still hadn't seen or heard anything from Jack, they decided it was time to call the police. On Tuesday, July 5th, 6 days after Jack was reported missing by his family, Derry Police Detective Mike Hoole pulled into the parking lot of a Target store. He wasn't in Derry anymore. He was about an hour's drive south in Saugus, Massachusetts. Hoole drove his car slowly, methodically moving through the rows of parked cars, keeping his eyes peeled for one particular vehicle. He was in charge of Jack's missing persons case, which, so far, had not gone anywhere. According to Jack's family, the last time anyone had definitely seen or heard from him was on June 27th, 2 full days before he was even reported missing. But his family couldn't think of anywhere he might have gone or anyone who might want to hurt him. So initially, Hoole had figured that Jack might have just driven off for some time alone. He thought he would probably come home sooner or later. But that morning, he'd gotten another call from Jack's daughter, Megan. She told him that the family had been putting up missing person posters all over town. Someone had seen one of the posters and called her. This person claimed they had seen Jack's dump truck parked at this specific target in Saugus, more than 40 miles away from Derry. The tip was unusual enough that Hoole decided he should drive out and take a look for himself. And now, as he slowly made his way towards the back of the sprawling parking lot, he saw it. A red and black dump truck parked near the far corner. Hoole stopped his car, got out, and walked over to take a closer look. Right away, he saw the license plate. It matched. This was definitely Jack's truck. Hoole peered in through the driver's side window. He didn't see anyone inside. But then he noticed something else. There were flies, dozens of them, buzzing around the back of the truck, around the open bed of the dump truck. Whatever was in there, the flies were very attracted to it. And there was also a smell. A rotten, awful smell was wafting out from the back of the truck. Hoole put on a pair of latex gloves and climbed up the side of the dump truck to look into the bed. The bed of the truck was covered by a large tarp. Hoole grabbed a corner of the tarp and pulled it back. But he still couldn't see what was underneath. Whatever was in the bed of the truck was also wrapped in a thick layer of plastic, and there was a lot of it. So he pulled out a small knife from his pocket and began carefully cutting through the plastic. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole stood by as workers from the medical examiner's office loaded Jack's body, still wrapped in all that plastic, into their van. Hoole desperately wanted to get a look at the body to try and figure out how Jack had died. But that would have required cutting through all the plastic, and he knew he needed to leave all of that intact for evidentiary purposes. He would just have to wait for the autopsy to find out the official cause of death. But based on the way Jack's body had been disposed of, hidden in a parking lot 40 miles from his home, Hoole was already guessing this was a murder. And not just any murder, but one that was carefully planned, most likely by somebody that Jack knew. Hoole had already learned from the family that Jack had 5 children with 2 different women. He figured there could be some hidden tensions there that the family wasn't telling him about. But he also thought the murder could be tied to Jack's business. As far as Jack's family knew, everything he did with his business was legitimate and above board. But it was entirely possible that he might have gotten involved with some sketchy people, or maybe done something that made a client angry, things the family wouldn't know about. And leaving Jack's dead body in the back of his own dump truck, that definitely seemed like a way to send a message. Once the forensics team had taken all their photos and swabbed the truck for any potential DNA and fingerprints, Hoole pulled on a fresh pair of latex gloves and opened the driver's side door. There was no blood inside the cab of the truck. No sign of a weapon. There was really nothing that struck him as unusual or helpful. That is, until he saw the logbook. It was tucked into a pocket on the passenger side door. He reached for it, pulled it out, and began to flip through the pages. He saw a list of all of Jack's appointments, along with the names, addresses, and phone numbers of the clients who had hired him. The last job that was recorded in the book was on the morning of June 27th back in Derry, where Jack lived. There were no other jobs noted down for that day. But a couple of pages later, on an otherwise blank page, Hoole found an entry that Jack seemed to have scribbled down in a rush. It was just an address, 145 North Road, with no town listed. And the name next to it was just Charlie. Hoole carefully placed the logbook inside an evidence bag and sealed it. Then, as he looked around the area, he noticed the security cameras mounted on the light posts all over the parking lot. And as luck would have it, there was one pointing directly at the spot where Jack's truck had been parked. The next day, Wednesday, July 6th, Hoole was back at the precinct in Derry. He was sitting at his desk reading over an autopsy report that had just been sent over from the Massachusetts medical examiner. The description in the report was grim. It said that Jack had been severely beaten. He had broken ribs, multiple skull fractures, and a softball-sized hole in the side of his head. His face had been so badly mangled that the medical examiner had actually needed to use Jack's dental records to positively confirm his identity. Hoole thought that this level of violence definitely made the murder feel personal. It only strengthened his belief that Jack's killer, or killers, was somebody who knew him. Just then, Hoole heard a knock at his door. He looked up as another officer peeked his head into the office and asked him to come take a look at something. Hoole stood up from his desk and followed the officer down the hallway to another room. A team of investigators was there, poring over the security footage from the Target parking lot. Hoole watched over their shoulders as the investigators pulled up a specific clip. He could see from the timestamp in the corner of the screen that the footage was from around 5:30 in the afternoon on June 27th. That was the same day as the last job written in Jack's logbook. Once the video was on the screen, Hoole nodded for the investigators to press play. He watched as the footage played. It showed Jack's dump truck pulling into the parking lot. It was being followed closely by a white minivan. After Jack's truck parked, two people got out of the truck. Unfortunately, the video quality was so poor, it was impossible to identify really anything about them. They couldn't tell if they were men or women, their height, their build. It was all just a fuzzy blur. However, there was one thing that was definitely clear. It was what they were doing. They were clearly dumping Jack's body. One of them went around to the back of the dump truck and checked to make sure the tarp was secure. Then they both walked over to the white minivan, got in, and drove away. Hoole's mind was racing. It now looked like there were at least 3 people involved in Jack's murder. There were the 2 people who were in the truck and then whoever was driving the white minivan. But another unfortunate reality was that the footage was so fuzzy they couldn't even make out the license plate of the minivan. Hoole was naturally frustrated by this. But then, the investigator said there was actually one more thing he wanted to show him. He pulled up another portion of security video. This one was from the evening of July 4th. That was 7 days after Jack's dump truck was left abandoned in the parking lot, and just 1 day before Hoole himself found the truck parked in that very spot. The investigator told Hoole that this footage he was about to see was from a different security camera, one that was positioned on the other side of the parking lot from where the dump truck was parked. When he hit play, he directed Hoole's attention to one particular car that was pulling into the lot. The angle on this car was much closer, so there was a lot more detail visible than in the first video. And as Hoole watched, he saw what was clearly a young woman get out of the passenger seat and walk toward the Target store. Hoole leaned in closer and squinted at the screen. And then he realized he recognized this woman. It was Jack's own daughter, Megan. Later that day, Hoole walked into an interrogation room in the Derry police station. Megan was waiting for him. When Hoole walked in, he made a point to shake her hand and smile, trying to act as friendly and sympathetic as possible. He did not want to let on that he was now looking at her as a potential suspect. He didn't mention that they had video of her in the exact same parking lot where her father's body was found, just a day before the discovery. But as they started talking, Megan actually brought it up herself. She mentioned that she just happened to have been in that same parking lot. She said she had been shocked when she found out that her father was not only dead, but that his body had been dumped in that particular Target lot because she had just been there. She explained that her boyfriend, Walter's sister, lived in Saugus, and they had gone to visit her for the 4th of July. She said they were trying to get their minds off her father's disappearance because at that time his body hadn't been found yet. Megan said they had unexpectedly decided to spend the night there, so they had driven to the nearest Target to pick up a contact lens case. As she said it, she just shook her head and said she couldn't believe her dad had basically been right there the whole time. That she had been so close to him. Hoole had to admit, the story didn't sound completely crazy. After all, in the security video, Megan didn't go anywhere near the part of the parking lot where Jack's truck was parked. But still, he had a very hard time believing that this was just one big tragic coincidence. especially because when he was reviewing what Megan had told the police when she first reported her father missing, he realized that she had said she last saw her dad on the night of Monday, June 27th. She claimed she and her boyfriend Walter had gone to his trailer to pick up an air conditioner. But now, Hoole knew that was impossible. The security video showed that Jack's body was already in the dump truck in that parking lot on the afternoon of June 27th. So during this interview, Hoole asked Megan again, "When was the last time you saw your father?" And once again, without missing a beat, she said it was the night of June 27th. Hoole asked her if she was positive about that date. And she said, yes, absolutely. Without tipping his hand that he was certain she was lying, Hoole let her go. He immediately called in her boyfriend, Walter, who had been waiting out in the hallway. According to Megan, Walter was the one who had driven her to that target in Saugus. Hoole wanted to question the couple separately so he could see if there were any contradictions in their stories. But when he spoke to Walter, Walter repeated the exact same things Megan had just said. He talked about visiting his sister and why they went to that target to get a contact lens case. Walter also included the detail about the last time they saw Jack being the night of the 27th. So basically, Walter and Megan's stories were identical. But to Hoole, the only thing he thought when he heard this consistency was that it was too perfect. Clearly, Megan and Walter had rehearsed this story. It was their alibi. But they didn't realize there was timestamped security footage that completely contradicted it. The following afternoon, Hoole sat at his desk, combing through a copy of Jack's phone records. He had sent officers out that morning to interview all of Megan's family and friends to see if they knew anything that could help them pin the blame on her. They had quickly learned that Megan and Walter had moved in together recently and that Jack did not approve. So Hoole began to wonder, maybe the young couple had killed Jack so he would stay out of their way. At some point, Megan found out from her friends that the police were investigating her. She had already called Hoole to revise her testimony. She was now claiming that actually, the last time she saw her dad was on the night of the 26th, not the 27th. But Hoole didn't buy it. She and Walter had both made the exact same mistake about the date. They had both seemed so confident when they said the 27th. Hoole was hoping that if he could just retrace Jack's steps on the day of his death, he would find some concrete proof that Megan and Walter were somehow involved. Hoole had already called around to check on the last scheduled job in Jack's logbook, the one on the morning of June 27th. The client had confirmed that Jack was definitely there. And security footage from the local dump had shown Jack's truck dropping off a load of trash afterwards around 2 in the afternoon. But that left about a 3-hour gap on the afternoon of June 27th where Jack's whereabouts were unaccounted for. And Jack had to have been killed sometime within that window. So now, Hoole hoped that Jack's phone records might help him figure out where Jack went after leaving the dump that afternoon. Hoole had been able to match most of the phone numbers that Jack had dialed or received calls from to contacts in his logbook. Except for one. On the morning of June 27th, he had gotten a call from a number that wasn't anywhere in his contacts. And then at 2:07 that afternoon, while Jack was finishing up at the dump, just a few hours before his dead body was left in that Target parking lot, he'd gotten a second call from that same number. Hoole called the number, but it went straight to voicemail. So he contacted the cell phone provider and asked them to look up who this number belonged to. He found out it was registered to a man named Charlie W. Suddenly, something clicked in Hoole's mind. He reached over, grabbed Jack's logbook, and flipped to the page where Jack had scribbled down that address, 145 North Road, and the name Charlie. This had to be the same Charlie who had called from that unknown number. And that meant this Charlie may have been the last person to see Jack alive. Or maybe Charlie was the one who killed him. The employee from the cell phone provider also told Hoole that the number came from a prepaid phone, the kind you can buy at a convenience store and load minutes onto without signing up for a contract. And it had been activated on June 19th, just 8 days before Jack's murder. Hoole asked the worker to send over a full copy of the prepaid phone's call records, and then they hung up. He logged on to the police database and looked up the name Charlie W., but he didn't find anything. No criminal records, no driver's licenses, no car registrations. Hoole had a strong feeling that this had to be a fake name. What seemed to confirm that even further was when he looked up the address, 145 North Road, that was in the book next to the name Charlie. There was no Charlie affiliated with that property at all. The owner of 145 North Road was somebody named Michael Connors. That name didn't mean anything to Hoole, and it certainly wasn't Charlie. So Hoole stood up from his desk and grabbed his car keys. It was time to go have a talk with whoever actually lived at 145 North Road. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole pulled onto a gravel driveway at 145 North Road, the address of the secluded farm scribbled in Jack Reed's logbook. He parked his car, walked up to the big white house, and rang the doorbell. The middle-aged man who answered the door seemed perfectly calm and composed until Hoole showed him his badge. Then, the man's entire demeanor changed. He started acting incredibly jumpy. As they stood in the doorway, Hoole asked the man if he was Michael Connors, and the man nodded and said yes. Hoole asked if he knew a man named Jack Reed, and Michael quickly said no. And when Hoole asked why his address was in Jack Reed's logbook, Michael stammered, saying he didn't know. It was already obvious to Hoole that Michael knew more than he was letting on. So he asked Michael where he had been on the afternoon of June 27th. Michael, very nervously and very quickly, said that he had spent the entire day doing repair work at a friend's lake house 30 miles away. He said he didn't get home until late that night. And then he gave Hoole the names of a few other contractors who were also working on the repairs, people who could verify his alibi. Hoole, without revealing how suspicious he was of this guy, wrote down the contractors' names and contact information. Then, as calmly as he could, he asked Michael if he could take a look around, both inside his house and outside. Michael, looking resigned at this point, just nodded and said yes. He stepped aside, and Hoole walked into the house. He began walking from room to room, but he didn't see any blood or anything else that was obviously suspicious. But then he went outside. He found a muddy path that led over to the barn, which was a short distance from the main house. When he reached the barn, he pulled open the heavy wooden door, and sunlight flooded in. Hoole stepped inside, and right away he was struck by how neat it was. He began looking behind hay bales, he shined his flashlight into the dark corners, and he bent down to examine the dirt and straw on the ground. But it was like the barn was spotless. It was almost like it had recently been cleaned, really thoroughly. When Hoole was done in the barn, he went back outside and walked towards the main house. As he did, he saw Michael standing by the back door, staring right at him. It looked like he had been watching him closely the entire time he was over at the barn. Hoole walked over to Michael, and very calmly, he asked him one last question. Did he know anyone named Megan Reed? And Michael said no. But the way he said it was noticeably less anxious, as if for the first time he was actually telling the truth. After that, as Hoole walked back to his car to leave, he thought that even though he hadn't found any hard evidence at the farm, Michael's strange behavior seemed to be saying a lot. Later that day, Hoole hung up the phone in his office, feeling very frustrated. He had called every single one of the contractors whose names Michael had given him, and they had all confirmed his alibi. Michael had been doing repairs at his friend's house 30 miles away at the time of Jack's death. So, Hoole figured that Michael couldn't have been directly involved in the murder. But based on his very suspicious behavior, it seemed likely that he knew something had happened on his property, maybe while he was away. This gave Hoole something to work with. It could mean that at least one of Jack's killers was close enough with Michael that Michael was willing to lie to protect them. But that was about all he had. There was no obvious link between Michael Connors and Jack's daughter Megan and her boyfriend Walter, who were still his only real suspects. He was starting to think that maybe he had been looking in the wrong direction, that maybe Megan and Walter weren't involved after all. It was still only a few days into the investigation, and there were plenty of other potential suspects to look into, like Jack's ex-partners, his adult children from his first relationship, and all the other clients in his logbook. But just then, Hoole's fax machine whirred to life. The cell phone provider was finally sending over the call records from Charlie's prepaid phone. Once it was done printing, Hoole ripped the sheet out of the machine and began looking over the call log. The phone had only been activated a week before Jack's murder, and it hadn't been used at all since the evening Jack was killed. And every single call that had been made or received on that phone was to Jack's number, except for one. And when Hoole looked into the owner of that one other number, everything about the case began to fall into place. Based on those phone records, as well as interviews with the various suspects, this is what police believe happened to Jack Reed on the 27th of June, 2005. That afternoon, while Jack's dump truck was pulling into the gravel driveway at 145 North Road, two of his killers were inside the house waiting for him. One of them was sitting on the couch, nervously tapping their feet. The other killer looked up and shot them an annoyed look, as if to say, "Stop tapping your feet," and they did. But just then, the doorbell rang. The calmer of the two killers walked over to answer it, while the more nervous one stayed on the couch. The nervous one listened as the door opened. They could hear the sound of their accomplice greeting Jack. A few seconds later, Jack walked into the living room. When the nervous killer saw Jack, they kind of jumped to their feet and tried to act natural, but they were likely acting incredibly nervous. After a short, awkward conversation between the three of them, they all left the main house and walked down the dirt path towards the barn. As they walked, the nervous killer hung back, walking a few steps behind Jack. As they got close to the barn, their heart began to pound. They had rehearsed this a dozen times, and they knew exactly what they had to do, but actually doing it was going to be the hard part. Then, the doors to the barn were opened. Inside, Jack would have seen two more people waiting for him. But before Jack could react, the nervous killer from behind leapt forward and tackled Jack to the ground. A second later, the nervous killer heard a loud thump. They looked up to see one of their accomplices standing above them, holding a hammer that was now dripping with blood. The nervous killer climbed to their feet and looked down at Jack, who was now lying on the floor of the barn with a gaping hole in the side of his skull. The sight was so gruesome that the nervous killer had to run outside and vomit. When they came back inside, the other three had unrolled a big sheet of plastic on the floor of the barn. They were placing Jack's body in the center of it. Blood was still pouring out of his head, pooling into a big red puddle on the plastic. It was a horrific scene. Then one of the killers grabbed the bloody hammer and said that if they could just stop Jack's heart, it would stop the bleeding. So they raised the hammer and began pounding on Jack's chest. After that, the bleeding did slow down. The four killers worked together to wrap Jack's body in the plastic. Once he was all wrapped up, they carried him outside and loaded his body into the back of his own dump truck. The killer who had first answered the door, the calmer one, got in the driver's seat of the dump truck. The nervous killer, the one who had initially tackled Jack to the ground, climbed into the passenger seat. The other two, the ones who had been waiting in the barn, climbed into a white minivan. They followed behind as the dump truck drove all the way across state lines to Saugus, Massachusetts, more than an hour away. When they finally got to Saugus, they pulled into the first major parking lot they came across, a Target store. They parked the dump truck near the back of the lot. When they got out, the nervous killer double-checked the tarp to make sure it was secure. Then they, along with their calmer accomplice, walked across the lot to the white minivan and climbed inside. After that, all four killers drove all the way back to New Hampshire to clean up the barn. The farm's owner, Michael Connors, had told them he expected it to be left in perfect condition. Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, was not directly involved in the murder. However, he did know that the mastermind of the murder was going to be using his property while he was gone. He would later testify that he did not know what they were planning to do and just asked that they keep it clean when they were done. Ultimately, the reason he allowed his property to be used at all was because he was doing a favor for the mastermind of the murder, who was his longtime friend and business partner. That mastermind was also the very same self-made Las Vegas millionaire that Jack Reed himself had viewed as a huge success story, the man whose path in life Jack was hoping to emulate. The millionaire's name was John Brooks. He believed that when Jack had helped him move a few years back, Jack had stolen some of his motorcycles and jewelry. There was no evidence to back this up, but John Brooks was convinced, and he held a grudge. In retaliation, a few months after the move, Brooks had sent his son, Jesse, to Jack's home to scare him. That's who Jack had spotted in the middle of the night on his property almost 2 years ago, the strange prowler who had called out to him by name. But when Jack came outside to confront him and fired a gun at him, Jesse and his father didn't stop. Instead, Brooks only got angrier and vowed to get his revenge. So, he sent 4 people to New Hampshire to kill Jack. It was his son Jesse, Jesse's friend Michael Benton, who was not the same as the Michael who owned the farm, and 2 other men named Joseph Vroomman and Robin Knight. All 5 men were eventually convicted of taking part in the murder. John Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robin Knight was also sentenced to life. Michael Benton got 33 years to life. Joseph Vroomman was sentenced to between 17 and 35 years. And Jesse Brooks was sentenced to 15 to 30 years. He was released on parole in 2023. Thank you so much for watching. Jack Reed survived a difficult childhood, built a business from nothing, raised 5 children, and spent his entire life trying to give his family opportunities he never had himself. By all accounts, he should have been entering the happiest chapter of his life. But sometimes, tragedy doesn't arrive as chaos. Sometimes, it waits patiently in the background, for years. And by the time the victim realizes something is wrong, it's already too late. For Jack, it started with a strange man standing outside his trailer in the middle of the night. It ended with a parking lot, a dump truck, and a family forced to learn the truth in the worst way imaginable. Until next time.